Chapter 1, The Architecture of Silence. The morning light always reclaimed the coastal city before the warmth did, spilling a pale, silver illumination across the gray stone floor of the apartment. Chris watched the tide of light advance. He sat motionless at the edge of the heavy oak table, a half-empty cup of black coffee cooling between his palms, the porcelain offering a faint, failing warmth against the chill of early dawn. Across the wide, open room, Marie stood before the tall arched window, her silhouette framed by the vast, awakening expanse of the Atlantic Ocean outside. Her hands were buried deep in the pockets of her oversized woolen cardigan, her shoulders slightly curved as if she were bracing against a wind that existed only inside her own mind. Between them lay 30 feet of open space, an expanse that felt less like a physical distance and more like a deliberate, unmapped territory. For a decade, this room had been a sanctuary of shared vision, a place where his architectural blueprints and her mosaic glass sketches mingled on every surface. Now, the space felt altered, thick with an invisible sediment of things left unsaid. There was no hostility in the quiet that enveloped them, only a profound, heavy stillness, the kind that settles over a landscape just before the seasons irrevocably shift. Chris focused on the rhythmic sound of her breathing, a subtle rise and fall that was the only clock ticking in the room. He knew the precise geometry of her posture, the way her head tilted slightly to the left when she was lost in thought, calculating the arrangement of colors for a new project. Yet, as he looked at her through the haze of the morning light, he felt a strange, quiet vertigo. It was the sensation an architect feels when looking at a historical structure that appears perfectly intact from the outside, but whose internal timbers have begun to settle, shifting the center of gravity by fractions of an inch. The exterior remained magnificent, but the alignment was no longer true. Without turning around, Marie shifted her weight. Her hand emerged from her pocket, her fingers tracing a slow, absent path along the cold glass of the windowpane, leaving a faint trail of condensation in her wake. Outside, the sea was a restless canvas of slate gray and deep indigo, the waves crashing against the jagged cliffs below the cliffside terrace. She watched the water, her eyes reflecting the cold brilliance of the horizon. She did not need to turn to know Chris was watching her, she could feel the weight of his gaze, steady and protective, yet laced with a growing bewilderment that matched her own. They had reached an age, he at 33, she at 31, where life was supposed to have solidified into a predictable, permanent shape. Instead, the stability they had built felt increasingly like a cage made of their own histories. Chris looked down at his hands, where the calluses of years spent handling rough stone, measuring iron, and climbing through the hollow shells of dying buildings had left permanent marks. He was a man who understood restoration, he knew how to inject resin into fractured concrete, how to reinforce a sagging arch, how to make the fragile whole again. But as his eyes drifted back to Marie, he realized with a dull ache that there were no blueprints for the delicate, unseen fractures widening between two human hearts. Marie finally turned away from the window, her movements deliberate and slow, as if she were navigating a room filled with invisible, fragile obstacles. She walked toward the kitchen counter, her bare feet making no sound against the polished floorboards. She picked up a small, ceramic bowl filled with discarded fragments of colored glass, deep cobalt, vibrant amber, and muted sage. These were the remnants of her latest mosaic, the pieces that didn't fit the grand design, left over to be ground down or repurposed. She picked up a shard of cobalt blue, holding it up to the light. It was sharp, jagged, and beautiful in its isolation. Chris watched her fingers manipulate the glass. He wanted to rise from the table, to cross the expanse of the room, to wrap his arms around her waist from behind and bury his face in the crook of her neck, just as he had done 1,000 times before in the earlier chapters of their life. He wanted to feel the familiar anchor of her presence. But a strange, paralyzing inertia held him in place. It was the recognition that an embrace would only be a temporary scaffold, a superficial support that could not truly fix the deep, structural shift occurring beneath their feet. The silence between them was not empty, it was dense, crowded with the ghosts of their past certainty. It contained the memory of the early years in this very city, when their poverty was an adventure and their small apartment was filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of creation. Now, prosperity and recognition had brought them space, a larger home, independent studios, separate routines, but the space had grown an appetite of its own, consuming the small, daily overlaps that had once bound them together. Marie set the cobalt shard back into the bowl with a tiny, sharp clink that resonated through the quiet apartment like a solitary musical note. She looked across the room, her gaze meeting Chris's for the first time that morning. There was no anger in her dark eyes, only a vast, searching melancholy that mirrored his own. They looked at one another across the kitchen island, two people who loved each other deeply, yet found themselves standing on opposite sides of a widening chasm, neither knowing how to build the bridge to cross it. The clock on the wall chimed the hour, its mechanical tone breaking the spell. Marie gave a minimal, bittersweet nod, a silent acknowledgement of the day's demands, before picking up her coat and her bag of glass shards. Chris rose from the table, his chair scraping softly against the floor, but by the time he stood fully upright, she was already moving toward the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut behind her was the final note of the morning, leaving Chris alone in the silver light, surrounded by the flawless, silent architecture of their shared isolation. Chapter 2, The Weight of Crumbling Stone. The winter air outside the apartment was sharp, smelling of salt-crusted iron and wet slate. Chris walked down the winding stone staircases of the old quarter, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his heavy wool coat, his eyes scanning the horizon where the gray silhouette of the city met the churning sea. His destination lay at the eastern edge of the historic Port District, a massive, decaying 17th-century customs house that had been abandoned to the damp coastal air for nearly 4 decades. It was a structure he had been commissioned to save, a labyrinth of sagging timber beams, waterlogged limestone foundations, and vaulted brick ceilings that threatened to collapse under the weight of their own history. To Chris, the building was not merely a professional assignment, it was a sanctuary where the laws of physics were predictable, where a problem could always be measured, mapped, and systematically cured. When he arrived at the site, the iron gates groaned against the wind, their rusted hinges protesting the intrusion. The interior of the customs house was cold, an echoing cavern of shadows where the only light filtered through cracked clerestory windows high above. Dust motes danced in the pale geometric beams of sun, settling on the damp floorboards like a shroud. Chris stood in the center of the grand atrium, breathing in the familiar scent of old mortar, dry rot, and lime wash. He unrolled a thick bundle of architectural blueprints across a makeshift plywood table, weighing the edges down with chunks of fallen masonry. The white lines on the blue paper were clean, precise, and absolute, a perfect contrast to the chaotic, decaying reality of the physical structure surrounding him. The heavy sound of work boots echoing against the stone heralded the arrival of Julian. At 35, Julian possessed the rugged, unhurried demeanor of a man who had spent his life evaluating the structural integrity of the city's oldest monuments. He stopped a few paces from the table, his eyes tracking the massive cracks that spiderwebbed across the western support arch. Without a word, Julian pulled a brass plumb bob from his leather tool belt, suspending the heavy weight from a string held against the masonry line. He watched the pendulum settle, noting the subtle, dangerous tilt of the wall. He caught Chris's eye, pointing silently to the measurement on his steel rule, his expression grim. It was an unspoken assessment they both understood perfectly. The building was shifting faster than their current reinforcement strategy could handle. Chris rubbed his temples, feeling the grit of the ancient dust already coating his skin. He looked from the blueprints to the fracturing archway, tracing the path of the stress lines with a practiced eye. Julian moved to the base of the pillar, tapping the limestone with a small wooden mallet, listening closely to the dull, hollow thunk that signaled internal voiding. Julian shook his head slowly, a silent warning that the core of the pillar was turning to powder. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of chalk, and drew a thick, bold cross over the heart of the stone, a visual condemnation, marking the area that required immediate, invasive stabilization before the roof came down. The silence between the two men was professional and deep, born from years of shared labor on the bones of the city. As Julian moved further into the shadows to inspect the foundation piers, Chris remained at the table, his fingers tracing the immaculate lines of the drawings. His mind, however, refused to stay anchored to the geometry of the customs house. The fractures in the limestone arch morphed in his mind's eye into the invisible chasm that had separated him from Marie that morning. He thought of her standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the ocean, completely unreachable despite being only a few feet away. Here, in this dying building, he knew exactly what tools were required. He could order steel tie rods, command hydraulic jacks to lift the sagging floors, and pump liquid grout into the hollow stone to restore its strength. But in the quiet expanse of their apartment, he felt utterly powerless, lacking the vocabulary or the instruments to measure the decay of their intimacy. Later in the morning, the heavy wooden doors at the entrance creaked open again, admitting a sudden gust of wind and a younger woman carrying an oversized leather portfolio. Clara, the newly assigned historical archivist for the project, stepped into the dust-choked atrium. At 28, she carried herself with a bright, unburdened energy that felt almost foreign in the solemn, shadowed world Chris and Julian inhabited. She did not hesitate at the threshold. Instead, she moved quickly toward the plywood table, her eyes wide with a genuine, infectious fascination for the crumbling surroundings. She carefully laid out a series of fragile, yellowed historical documents, original hand-drawn schematics of the customs house from 2 centuries prior, beside Chris's modern blueprints. Chris watched as Clara's slender fingers gently smoothed the edges of the ancient parchment. She pointed to a specific section of the foundation drawing, a hidden drainage culvert that had been omitted from all contemporary maps of the site. Her finger tracked the forgotten waterway, showing how it had been slowly undermining the western arch from below for decades. Chris leaned over the table, his shoulder nearly touching hers, as he studied the old ink lines. Clara's discovery was a revelation. It explained the mysterious settling of the masonry that had baffled him for weeks. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by a sudden beam of sunlight, her eyes bright with the thrill of the breakthrough. Chris felt a strange, unsettling sensation stir within his chest, not a spark of romance, but a sudden, sharp awareness of how effortless human connection could be when it was unburdened by history. With Clara, there were no years of accumulated silence, no unspoken griefs, no expectations weighing down every glance. It was a clean, simple interaction based entirely on the present moment. He looked from Clara's bright, animated face back to the dark, cavernous depths of the building, and a deep sense of guilt settled over him. He felt as though he were committing a silent betrayal merely by appreciating the lightness of her presence, a lightness that had long since vanished from the home he shared with Marie. Meticulous care. She gave Chris a small, encouraging smile before turning to walk out into the fading winter light, her footsteps echoing cheerfully until the heavy iron gates clicked shut behind her. Chris remained alone in the darkening atrium for a long time. The pale sun had dipped below the harbor buildings, plunging the customs house into a deep, monolithic shadow. He looked up at the western arch, where Julian's chalk cross glowed faintly in the gloom, a stark, ghostly reminder of impending collapse. He rolled up his blueprints, the paper snapping sharply in the quiet room. He had found the hidden source of the building's decay today, but as he prepared to return to the apartment on the cliffs, the weight of the crumbling stone seemed to transfer entirely to his own shoulders. He knew that fixing the foundations of his life would require a kind of excavation he was not sure he had the strength to survive. Chapter 3: The Geometry of Broken Glass. The north-facing windows of the industrial loft caught the sharp, uncompromising glare of the midday sky, turning Marie's studio into an aquarium of cold, brilliant light. Here, 3 miles away from the quiet apartment on the cliff and the dusty cavern of Chris's restoration project, the air smelled intensely of linseed oil, volcanic grout, and the sharp, metallic tang of industrial glass cutters. Marie stood before a massive plywood easel that dominated the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the sweeping charcoal outline of her latest commission, a towering, multi-paneled installation intended for a public gallery space. In her right hand, she held a heavy pair of steel-wheeled nippers, in her left, a thick slab of opaque, hand-blown Venetian glass the color of a bruised twilight sky. With a swift, practiced squeeze of her forearm, the steel wheels bit into the glass. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the high-ceilinged room as the slab fractured precisely along the score line, splitting into dozens of unpredictable, jagged fragments. Marie did not flinch. She set the tool down and let her bare fingers sift through the debris on her workbench, searching for the exact shape her eye demanded. Her skin was mapped with dozens of tiny, faint white scars, the permanent receipts of her profession. She picked up a triangular shard no larger than a fingernail, its edges razor-sharp, and held it up to the light. This was her life's geometry, taking objects that had been violently broken, stripped of their original purpose, and forcing them into a new, harmonious configuration where their fractures became the very lines that defined their beauty. In the corner of the studio, sitting in a faded velvet armchair surrounded by decades of art journals and skeletal iron armatures, sat Elena. At 58, Marie's mentor was a woman carved out of stone and cigarette smoke, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot. She did not speak, she had no need to. Elena simply watched Marie work, her sharp, heavily hooded eyes tracking the younger woman's movements with the clinical precision of a hawk. Elena understood the language of glass better than anyone living in the coastal city, but more importantly, she understood the precise cost of total artistic devotion. She had watched Marie grow from a hesitant student into a master craftsman, and she could recognize the subtle, erratic rhythm of Marie's current creation. The placement of the pieces on the board was too aggressive, the choices too sharp, the colors too dense with shadow. Marie applied a thick, gray layer of adhesive to the back of the twilight-colored shard and pressed it firmly into the charcoal sketch. It sat adjacent to a fragment of clear, pale amber that Chris had found on a Mediterranean beach 5 years ago and gifted to her. The contrast between the two pieces was beautiful but jarring, the warm, sun-kissed memory of their past colliding directly with the cold, dark reality of her present mood. As her fingertips smoothed the surface of the mosaic, ensuring the planes of the glass were perfectly level, she felt a profound, suffocating wave of isolation. Her thoughts drifted back to the morning, to the silent choreography she and Chris had performed across the kitchen island. For years, she had believed that their work complemented each other perfectly. He preserved the grand structures that sheltered humanity, while she decorated the surfaces that gave those structures a soul. They were supposed to be the perfect alignment of form and expression. But lately, she felt as though they were living in two entirely different dimensions of history. Chris was obsessed with structural permanence, with keeping ancient stones from succumbing to the gravity of time. Marie, however, dealt exclusively with the aftermath of destruction. She knew that once glass was shattered, it could never become a window again, it could only become a mosaic, something entirely different, something born out of a fundamental loss. Elena rose slowly from her armchair, her joints popping slightly in the cold studio air. She walked over to the easel, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her posture mimicking that of a severe museum curator. She stood just inches from Marie, her gaze fixed on the center of the artwork where the dark, jagged fragments were beginning to crowd out the light. Without a word, Elena reached out with a long, wrinkled finger and tapped a section of the mosaic where Marie had forced 3 overlapping pieces of dark indigo glass into a space meant for one. Elena's hand moved to a small wooden box on the edge of the desk, lifting a single, irregular sliver of pure white milk glass. She held it against the dark mass of Marie's composition, a silent, powerful critique that cut through the artistic tension of the room. It was an unspoken lesson Marie had learned a decade ago: without negative space, without light to define the borders of the dark, the mosaic would become nothing more than a heavy, illegible scar of glass. Marie looked at the white sliver in her mentor's hand, then up into Elena's lined, unyielding face. In the older woman's eyes, Marie saw a terrifying glimpse of her own potential future. Elena lived alone in a drafty apartment above the gallery, surrounded only by her masterpieces and her ghosts, having systematically stripped away every human attachment that threatened to distract her from her craft. She had loved deeply once, decades ago, but when forced to choose between the compromise of a shared life and the absolute freedom of her studio, she had chosen the glass. Marie felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Was this the destination she and Chris were hurtling toward? Was the silence in their apartment not an accident, but the natural, inevitable price of two people throwing their entire souls into separate, uncompromising creative worlds? Marie did not take the white glass from Elena's hand. Instead, she picked up her steel nippers again, turned back to the easel, and with a deliberate, forceful motion, pried the 3 overlapping indigo fragments from the board, scraping away the wet adhesive until the bare wood underneath was exposed like an open wound. Elena watched her for a moment longer, then let out a slow, imperceptible breath, setting the white shard down on the edge of the workbench before retreating back into the shadows of her velvet chair. As the afternoon light faded into the pale violet of dusk, the studio grew progressively colder. Marie worked on in the gathering gloom, refusing to turn on the overhead electric lights. She wanted to see the glass exactly as it was dying in the natural light, watching how the vibrant blues and deep ambers lost their color and turned to uniform shades of charcoal and black. Her hands were tired, her fingers cramped from hours of precise manipulation, but she could not stop. Every shard she placed felt like an unspoken confession, an attempt to articulate the grief of a love that was structurally sound but emotionally hollow. When she finally laid down her tools for the night, her knuckles were stained with gray mortar and a single, thin line of dried crimson where a shard of twilight glass had pushed back against her touch. Chapter 4, The Domestic Horizon. The kitchen clock struck 8, its mechanical pulse the loudest sound remaining in the apartment. Chris sat at the kitchen island, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of a clean white ceramic plate that held 2 untouched portions of roasted vegetables and cold fish. The food had lost its steam an hour ago, settling into a dull, unappetizing stillness under the yellow glow of the overhead pendant lamp. He had not changed out of his work clothes, his dark canvas trousers were still dusted with the fine white lime powder from the customs house vaults, and a faint scent of damp stone and ancient mortar clung to his wool sweater. He looked down at his watch, watching the thin red second hand sweep around the dial, measuring the precise intervals of his waiting. The heavy oak front door clicked open, breaking the stagnation of the room. Marie stepped over the threshold, her movements weighed down by the exhaustion of 12 hours at the easel. She immediately dropped her canvas tote bag onto the entryway bench, the heavy clink of glass fragments within signaling her return. Chris did not rise to greet her, nor did she look immediately toward the kitchen. Instead, she stood by the door for several long seconds, her head pressed lightly against the cool wood of the frame, her eyes closed as if she were letting the transition from the cold outer world to the heavy interior of their home settle over her skin. When she finally walked into the living area, the contrast between them was total, yet their expressions were perfectly mirrored in their fatigue. Her hands, when she pulled them from her pockets to unwrap her scarf, showed the dried gray stains of grout around the fingernails and the small white adhesive bandage wrapped tightly around her thumb. She approached the kitchen island, her eyes drifting down to the cold dinner Chris had prepared. She gave a minimal, tight-lipped smile, an acknowledgement of his effort, a silent thank you that carried no joy, before sliding onto the stool across from him. They ate in a rhythmic, coordinated silence that spoke of a decade of shared domesticity. There was no need for speech to coordinate the passing of the salt, the pouring of water from the glass pitcher, or the clearing of the small side plates. Every gesture was polished by time, executed with a practiced efficiency that bypassed the need for communication entirely. Yet, this seamless coordination felt less like intimacy and more like the synchronized movements of 2 actors performing a play they had long since ceased to feel. They were perfectly attuned to each other's physical presence, but completely insulated from each other's internal lives. Chris watched her across the narrow expanse of the marble countertop. In the soft light, the fine lines around her eyes seemed deeper, carved by the uncompromising glare of her studio windows and the harsh demands of her art. He thought of Clara's bright, unburdened laughter from earlier that afternoon, the way the young archivist had looked up at him with unreserved enthusiasm over the yellowed historical maps. That lightness felt like an artifact from another universe, a resource that had been entirely depleted within the walls of this apartment. Looking at Marie, he felt a crushing sense of historical gravity. They were carrying the weight of 10 years of accumulation, every minor disappointment, every unexpressed grief, every sacrificed ambition, and it was flattening the space between them. Marie kept her gaze focused primarily on her plate, her fork moving the food around without much appetite. She was acutely aware of the lime dust on Chris's sleeves, the scent of the dying customs house that he had brought home with him. It smelled of old foundations, of things buried deep beneath the earth that were slowly being excavated. She wondered if he had found what he was looking for in those ruins, or if he was simply hiding there, using the collapse of historical structures to avoid witnessing the quiet, domestic demolition occurring right here. She thought of Elena's warning look, the cold emptiness of her mentor's solitary life, and the indigo fragments she had violently pried from her mosaic panel today. She wanted to reach across the counter, to grasp Chris's dust-coated hand and squeeze it until her fingers bruised, just to see if there was still an emotional pulse beneath the callus. But the invisible wall between them felt too solid, built of 1,000 small decisions to remain quiet rather than risk an argument. When the meal was finished, they cleaned the space with the same eerie, non-verbal precision. Chris washed the dishes at the sink, the rush of warm water filling the room with a brief, humid warmth, while Marie wiped down the marble surfaces with a damp cloth, her movements circular and hypnotic. As she wiped near his hand, her forearm brushed against his elbow. It was a momentary, accidental contact, but it caused them both to freeze for a fraction of a second. The skin-to-skin touch did not spark warmth, it felt like a sudden, static shock of awareness, reminding them both of what was missing. Chris did not pull away, and Marie did not immediately retreat, but the silence between them grew instantly denser, suffocating the brief remainder of the evening. Later, the apartment transitioned into the deep shadow of midnight. In the bedroom, the only illumination came from the moonlight filtering through the tall arched windows, casting long, barred shadows across the wooden floorboards. They lay in the king-sized bed, positioned on their respective sides, a vast expanse of white linen separating them like a neutral territory. Chris lay on his back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling plaster, tracing the faint hairline cracks that ran across the cornices. Marie lay on her side, facing the window, her back turned to him, her knees pulled slightly toward her chest in a protective posture. The distance between them and the bed was less than 3 feet, yet it felt as insurmountable as the ocean outside. Chris could hear the steady, rhythmic cadence of her breathing, knowing she was awake, knowing she was staring into the same silver darkness that he was. He reached out his left hand, his fingers extending across the cold sheet, stopping just short of the fabric of her nightgown. He hovered there for a long time, his hands suspended in the dark, caught in an agonizing paralysis. To touch her would mean demanding an entry into her grief that he wasn't sure he could handle, to pull away would be an admission that the separation was final. After what felt like hours, he withdrew his hand, curling his fingers into a tight fist against his own chest. On the other side of the bed, Marie felt the subtle shift in the mattress as he moved away, and she silently closed her eyes, letting a single, cold tear slip down her cheek into the pillow, unvocalized and unseen in the absolute perfection of their quiet night. Chapter 5, The Changing of the Season. A violent, unseasonal gale broke over the coastal city just before dawn, bringing with it a torrential downpour that transformed the cobblestone streets into rushing, oil-slicked canals. The wind howled against the exposed cliffs, rattling the ancient iron hinges of the apartment's panoramic windows and driving curtains of gray water against the glass with the force of thrown gravel. The ocean below had lost all its previous slate-gray composure, it was now a churning, furious expanse of whitecaps and deep, hollow swells that smashed relentlessly into the base of the stone cliffs, sending plumes of salt spray exploding high into the air. Inside the apartment, the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure made the air feel heavy, static, and charged with an unspoken electricity. Chris was the first to rise, driven from the bed by the rhythmic, aggressive rattling of the glass. He stood in the center of the living room, wearing only a thin cotton shirt and trousers, watching the storm rewrite the landscape outside. The silver morning light of the previous days had been completely swallowed by a thick, oppressive twilight that blurred the boundary between the sky and the sea. He walked from window to window, checking the heavy brass latches, securing the perimeters against the invading moisture. When he reached the final window overlooking the northern terrace, he noticed a thin, dark line of water already seeping across the stone sill, pooling on the polished hardwood floorboards below. He did not reach for a cloth to wipe it away. Instead, he knelt before the window, his fingers lightly touching the cold, spreading wetness. It was a leak he had patched himself 2 summers ago, using what he believed to be an unyielding, industrial sealant. The failure of the repair felt like a small, personal defeat. It was proof that no matter how meticulously an architect analyzed a structure, the elements would always find the hidden vulnerability, the microscopic pocket of air where decay could take root and bide its time until the right storm arrived. He remained on his knees in the gloom, watching the water slowly widen its footprint across the floor, feeling the chill of the stone seep through the fabric of his trousers into his joints. Marie emerged from the bedroom a few moments later, drawn by the low, resonant vibration of the wind in the chimney. She did not stop to look at him, her attention was immediately captured by the violence of the sea. She walked to the edge of the terrace doors, her body tense, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if she were absorbing the impact of the waves through her own bones. In the dim, stormy light, her skin appeared almost translucent, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. She watched a massive wave collide with the harbor wall half a mile away, watching the water shatter into millions of chaotic, brilliant fragments before being swallowed back into the dark mass of the deep. To Marie, the storm felt less like an external weather event and more like an outward manifestation of the internal pressure that had been building within their walls for months. The quiet, choreographed isolation of the past few weeks had been a fragile ecosystem, a delicate truce maintained by a mutual agreement to ignore the shifting foundations. But this sudden violence from the outside world seemed to shatter that illusion. The wind didn't just shake the glass, it exposed the absolute vulnerability of their sanctuary. She looked down at Chris, still kneeling by the leaking sill, his head bowed, his posture looking uncharacteristically defeated. For a fleeting second, the urge to cross the room and place her hand on his damp shoulder was so intense it made her throat ache. But the momentum of their collective silence was too powerful, a heavy current that pulled her backward, away from him, toward the safety of her own thoughts. Instead of approaching him, she turned toward the kitchen counter and began the routine of preparing tea, her movements accelerated by the nervous energy of the morning. The metal kettle clattered sharply against the cast-iron grate of the stove, the sound unnaturally loud against the backdrop of the rumbling gale. She watched the blue flame ignite beneath the kettle, its small, controlled heat looking pathetic and small compared to the vast, freezing tumult outside. She stood close to the burner, seeking its warmth, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that the changing of the season was not just happening outside. The autumn of their relationship had passed without them noticing, and they were now entering a cold, unyielding winter where the resources for survival were rapidly dwindling. Chris rose slowly from the floor, his knees cracking in the quiet room. He walked to the entryway, pulled his heavy oilskin slicker from the hook, and threw it over his shoulders. He needed to get to the customs house. A storm of this magnitude would test every temporary scaffold and wooden shoring beam he and Julian had erected over the past week. If the hidden drainage culvert Clara had discovered was flooding, the entire western arch could slide into the harbor before nightfall. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the iron handle, his eyes tracking back to Marie standing by the stove. The steam from the kettle was just beginning to rise, a pale, twisting column of white that disappeared into the shadows of the high ceiling. He wanted to say something, to leave a phrase behind that might act as an anchor for her while the storm raged around the cliffs. He wanted to acknowledge the leak in the window, the coldness in the air, the terrifying beauty of the sea. But the language required for such an admission felt completely out of his reach, buried under years of professional jargon and domestic habits. He adjusted the collar of his coat, pulled his hood over his eyes, and stepped out into the howling stairwell, closing the door firmly behind him. Marie did not move until the sound of his footsteps had been completely swallowed by the roar of the wind outside. She poured the boiling water over the tea leaves, watching them swirl and darken in the ceramic pot, releasing a bitter, herbal aroma that filled the kitchen. She took her cup back to the terrace doors, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, watching the rain erase the city skyline from view. The world outside was a shifting, unstable canvas of gray and white, and as she took her first sip of the hot liquid, she knew that by the time this storm finally spent its fury, the landscape of their lives would be permanently, unalterably changed. Chapter 6: The Inundation of Foundations. The harbor district had been transformed into an unforgiving theater of gray water and screaming wind by the time Chris reached the site. The Atlantic was no longer a neighbor, it had become an invader, throwing massive, foam-flecked swells completely over the concrete sea wall, sending torrents of salt water rushing down the narrow alleys toward the customs house. Chris fought his way through the iron gates, his oilskin coat snapping violently against his legs like a sail caught in a squall. Inside the ancient building, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than it had been on the open streets. The vast atrium acted as a giant sounding board, amplifying the roar of the storm outside into a deep, vibrating bass that rattled the teeth in his jaw. Water was everywhere. It dripped from the high clerestory windows where centuries-old lead seals had finally given way, creating a chaotic matrix of vertical silver lines that severed the darkness of the upper vaults. But the real danger was not descending from above, it was rising from beneath the earth. Chris sprinted toward the western wing, his heavy boots splashing through an inch of dark, stagnant water that had already collected across the flagstones. The air here was thick with the suffocating stench of ancient river mud, saturated timber, and the bitter, sharp smell of distressed lime mortar. Julian was already there, kneeling at the base of the compromised western arch, submerged to his shins in the rising tide. A single, battery-powered halogen work light sat on a high ledger stone, casting a harsh, theatrical glare across the scene, creating grotesque, dancing shadows that stretched up the fracturing wall. Julian didn't look up when Chris approached, but his movements were frantic. He was trying to wedge an adjustable steel shoreprop beneath the sagging shoulder of the lintel stone, his knuckles white as he turned the heavy iron collar against the rising pressure. The water around his boots was churning violently, bubbling up from the floorboards with a terrifying, rhythmic pulse that signaled a massive hydraulic pressure building beneath the foundation piers. Chris dropped to his knees beside him, ignoring the freezing water that immediately soaked through his canvas trousers. He grabbed the heavy steel shaft of the prop, lending his weight to the effort, helping Julian align the top plate with the ancient limestone. As he pushed, he looked up at the heart of the arch where Julian had drawn the chalk cross the day before. The white lines were blurring, washing away under a steady trickle of water that was weeping directly from the mortar joints. The crack had widened, what had been a hairline fracture 48 hours ago was now a dark, jagged fissure wide enough to swallow a man's finger. The stone was groaning, a low, structural protest that Chris could feel directly through the steel of the prop into the palms of his hands. A sudden flash of movement in the shadows near the flooded cellar stairs signaled the arrival of Clara. She had not stayed safe in her university archive, she had come to the site wrapped in an oversized yellow slicker that was slick with rain, her hair plastered to her skull in dark, wet ropes. In her arms, she held a heavy, wax-sealed leather tube, guarding it against the moisture as if it were a child. She waded through the rising water toward the table, her face pale but determined, her eyes reflecting the stark, clinical glare of the halogen lamp. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Clara unrolled a damp, transparent overlay map directly over the soaked blueprints on the plywood table. She pointed a trembling finger at the hidden drainage culvert she had discovered the day before. The historical maps indicated that this specific culvert was connected to an ancient subterranean overflow basin designed by 17th-century engineers to handle harbor surges. But over 200 years, the city had built modern sewer mains directly across the exit channel, effectively creating a subterranean bottleneck. The unseasonal gale had pushed the sea into the old basin, and with the exit blocked, the water had nowhere to go but up, erupting directly into the foundations of the customs house. Chris left Julian to secure the iron collar and moved to Clara's side, his eyes tracking the intricate ink lines of the historical network. Their faces were inches apart in the cramped circle of light, their breath forming a single, shared cloud of white vapor in the freezing air. Clara's research had provided the diagnosis, but the cure was terrifyingly invasive. To stop the inundation, they would have to deliberately breach a secondary retaining wall within the lower vaults, diverting the floodwater into an abandoned dry dock adjacent to the site before the pressure liquefied the soil beneath the main support pillars. Chris looked at Clara, seeing the raw, unadorned urgency in her eyes. There was an intense, exhilarating clarity to this moment that made his chest tighten. Here, in the middle of a structural catastrophe, everything was reduced to a binary equation of survival or collapse. The problems were massive, but they were tangible, they could be fought with steel props, historical maps, and physical labor. Clara's presence provided a sharp, bright focus. She was an ally in the dark, her intelligence matching his determination without the heavy baggage of unspoken resentment that waited for him on the cliffs. For a brief, dangerous instant, Chris felt a profound sense of relief at being here, in a collapsing ruin with a woman who looked at him with absolute trust, rather than in his own home where every glance was a negotiation of old grief. Julian's voice was represented by a sharp, metallic hammer blow as he struck the wedge of the steel shore into place, signaling that the temporary support was as tight as it could get. He stepped back from the pillar, wiping a mixture of sweat and salty rain from his forehead with the back of his muddy sleeve. He looked at Chris, then at Clara's overlay map, and then down into the dark, swirling vortex of the cellar stairs where the water was rising by an inch every 10 minutes. Julian gave a slow, grim nod, his hand pointing toward the sledgehammers resting against the western wall, a silent agreement that the time for measurement had passed, and the excavation of the lower vaults had to begin immediately. Chris picked up the heavy iron sledgehammer, its hickory handle cold and slick against his calloused palms. Chapter 6: The Inundation of Foundations. The harbor district had been transformed into an unforgiving theater of gray water and screaming wind by the time Chris reached the site. The Atlantic was no longer a neighbor, it had become an invader, throwing massive, foam-flecked swells completely over the concrete sea wall, sending torrents of salt water rushing down the narrow alleys toward the customs house. Chris fought his way through the iron gates, his oilskin coat snapping violently against his legs like a sail caught in a squall. Inside the ancient building, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than it had been on the open streets. The vast atrium acted as a giant sounding board, amplifying the roar of the storm outside into a deep, vibrating bass that rattled the teeth in his jaw. Water was everywhere. It dripped from the high clerestory windows where centuries-old lead seals had finally given way, creating a chaotic matrix of vertical silver lines that severed the darkness of the upper vaults. But the real danger was not descending from above, it was rising from beneath the earth. Chris sprinted toward the western wing, his heavy boots splashing through an inch of dark, stagnant water that had already collected across the flagstones. The air here was thick with the suffocating stench of ancient river mud, saturated timber, and the bitter, sharp smell of distressed lime mortar. Julian was already there, kneeling at the base of the compromised western arch, submerged to his shins in the rising tide. A single, battery-powered halogen work light sat on a high ledger stone, casting a harsh, theatrical glare across the scene, creating grotesque, dancing shadows that stretched up the fracturing wall. Julian didn't look up when Chris approached, but his movements were frantic. He was trying to wedge an adjustable steel shore prop beneath the sagging shoulder of the lintel stone, his knuckles white as he turned the heavy iron collar against the rising pressure. The water around his boots was churning violently, bubbling up from the floorboards with a terrifying, rhythmic pulse that signaled a massive hydraulic pressure building beneath the foundation piers. Chris dropped to his knees beside him, ignoring the freezing water that immediately soaked through his canvas trousers. He grabbed the heavy steel shaft of the prop, lending his weight to the effort, helping Julian align the top plate with the ancient limestone. As he pushed, he looked up at the heart of the arch where Julian had drawn the chalk cross the day before. The white lines were blurring, washing away under a steady trickle of water that was weeping directly from the mortar joints. The crack had widened. What had been a hairline fracture 48 hours ago was now a dark, jagged fissure wide enough to swallow a man's finger. The stone was groaning, a low, structural protest that Chris could feel directly through the steel of the prop into the palms of his hands. A sudden flash of movement in the shadows near the flooded cellar stairs signaled the arrival of Clara. She had not stayed safe in her university archive, she had come to the site wrapped in an oversized yellow slicker that was slick with rain, her hair plastered to her skull in dark, wet ropes. In her arms, she held a heavy, wax-sealed leather tube, guarding it against the moisture as if it were a child. She waded through the rising water toward the table, her face pale but determined, her eyes reflecting the stark, clinical glare of the halogen lamp. Without waiting for acknowledgement, Clara unrolled a damp, transparent overlay map directly over the soaked blueprints on the plywood table. She pointed a trembling finger at the hidden drainage culvert she had discovered the day before. The historical maps indicated that this specific culvert was connected to an ancient subterranean overflow basin designed by 17th-century engineers to handle harbor surges. But over 200 years, the city had built modern sewer mains directly across the exit channel, effectively creating a subterranean bottleneck. The unseasonal gale had pushed the sea into the old basin, and with the exit blocked, the water had nowhere to go but up, erupting directly into the foundations of the customs house. Chris left Julian to secure the iron collar and moved to Clara's side, his eyes tracking the intricate ink lines of the historical network. Their faces were inches apart in the cramped circle of light, their breath forming a single, shared cloud of white vapor in the freezing air. Clara's research had provided the diagnosis, but the cure was terrifyingly invasive. To stop the inundation, they would have to deliberately breach a secondary retaining wall within the lower vaults, diverting the floodwater into an abandoned dry dock adjacent to the site before the pressure liquefied the soil beneath the main support pillars. Chris looked at Clara, seeing the raw, unadorned urgency in her eyes. There was an intense, exhilarating clarity to this moment that made his chest tighten. Here, in the middle of a structural catastrophe, everything was reduced to a binary equation of survival or collapse. The problems were massive, but they were tangible. They could be fought with steel props, historical maps, and physical labor. Clara's presence provided a sharp, bright focus. She was an ally in the dark, her intelligence matching his determination without the heavy baggage of unspoken resentment that waited for him on the cliffs. For a brief, dangerous instant, Chris felt a profound sense of relief at being here, in a collapsing ruin with a woman who looked at him with absolute trust, rather than in his own home where every glance was a negotiation of old grief. Julian's voice was represented by a sharp, metallic hammer blow as he struck the wedge of the steel shore into place, signaling that the temporary support was as tight as it could get. He stepped back from the pillar, wiping a mixture of sweat and salty rain from his forehead with the back of his muddy sleeve. He looked at Chris, then at Clara's overlay map, and then down into the dark, swirling vortex of the cellar stairs where the water was rising by an inch every 10 minutes. Julian gave a slow, grim nod, his hand pointing toward the sledgehammers resting against the western wall, a silent agreement that the time for measurement had passed, and the excavation of the lower vaults had to begin immediately. Chris picked up the heavy iron sledgehammer, its hickory handle cold and slick against his calloused palms. He walked toward the dark opening of the stairs, the water swirling around his knees now, a heavy, dragging current that tried to pull him off balance. He looked back one last time at the table, where Clara was already weighting down the edges of her maps with wet pieces of historic brick, her face set in a mask of intense concentration. The storm outside howled with renewed fury, a wave crashing against the outer walls with a sound like thunder, but as Chris stepped down into the flooded dark of the basement, his mind was perfectly clear, anchored by the simple, brutal necessity of saving the structure before everything collapsed into the sea. Chapter 7: The Vulnerability of Mediums. The journey from the cliffside apartment to the industrial quarter was a battle against a landscape dissolving in real time. Marie drove her small vehicle through roads that had become shallow rivers, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic, useless rhythm against the sheets of water that blinded her view. The city looked hollowed out by the storm, its stone facade slick and black under the bruised sky, the street lamps flickering like dying stars. When she finally reached the old textile mill that housed her studio, the brick structure felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. The wind roared through the open courtyard, tearing loose corrugated iron sheets from the adjacent warehouses with a terrifying, metallic scream that was lost in the larger tumult of the gale. Inside the loft, the air was freezing and smelled heavily of damp plaster and old soot. Marie didn't turn on the lights. The natural gloom of the storm was more than enough to reveal the disaster waiting for her. A massive skylight 3 stories above her main workstation had fractured under the impact of flying debris, and a steady, merciless column of rain was plunging directly into the center of the room. It was hitting her massive plywood easel, the very structure holding her unfinished gallery mosaic, with a rhythmic, hollow drumming that sounded like a drumbeat heralding a defeat. She ran forward, her boots skidding on the wet floorboards. The damage was already severe. The water had saturated the charcoal layout lines she had drawn with such care, turning the precise geometric boundaries of her composition into a muddy, gray slurry that dripped down the wood like tears. More devastatingly, the moisture had compromised the thick, slow-drying cement adhesive she had used to mount the intricate twilight-colored glass shards the day before. The wet mortar was dissolving, liquefying into a milky paste, and as Marie watched in a state of numbed horror, several large, beautifully nipped segments of dark indigo Venetian glass slid slowly down the panel, losing their alignment entirely before detaching and shattering on the stone floor below. She dropped to her knees in the middle of the puddle, ignoring the cold water that instantly soaked through her wool trousers. Her fingers, already raw and bandaged from days of labor, scrambled through the rising water to salvage the fallen shards. She picked up a large, triangular piece of the cobalt glass she had fought so hard to place. Its sharp edges bit into her palm, but she welcomed the pain. It was a tangible, grounding reality in a world that felt like it was washing away. She held the piece tightly, her knuckles turning white, looking up at the skeletal outline of her ruined masterpiece. The negative space Elena had warned her about was no longer a deliberate choice, it was being carved out violently by the elements, leaving behind a jagged, illegible scar of wood and melting cement. A shadow shifted in the far corner of the room, near the velvet armchair, breaking the isolation of her panic. Elena sat there, completely motionless, wrapped in a heavy, moth-eaten fur coat that smelled of cedar and old turpentine. She had not tried to move the easel, she had not placed buckets beneath the leak. She had simply sat in the dark, watching the water destroy her students' work with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing an inevitable chemical reaction. A single unlit cigarette was held between her long, yellowed fingers, her hooded eyes reflecting the dull, gray light filtering through the broken skylight. Elena rose from the chair with an agonizing slowness, her posture stiff but unyielding against the chill of the room. She walked toward the center of the studio, her boots making a heavy, squelching sound against the wet floorboards. She stopped at the edge of the puddle where Marie was kneeling, looking down at the scattered glass and the weeping panel. Elena didn't offer a hand to help her up, nor did her face betray a single ounce of pity. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a heavy steel palette knife, and extended it toward Marie, her hand steady and unwavering. The gesture was a silent, brutal command that Marie understood instantly. Elena was not telling her to salvage what was left, she was ordering her to scrape the remaining pieces off the board entirely. The moisture had ruined the chemical bond of the entire section, to try to patch it now would be an act of cowardice, a compromise that would leave the structure of the artwork fundamentally flawed for the rest of its existence. The only honest choice was complete eradication, to strip the panel back to its bare, wounded wood and begin again from the mud. Marie looked from the palette knife to Elena's lined, expressionless face. The older woman's eyes were entirely devoid of comfort, but they held a profound, devastating wisdom. Elena had seen her own studio's flood, she had seen her own loves dissolve, she had survived by learning the art of the clean scrape. Marie realized then that the storm had not brought anything new into the room, it had simply accelerated the truth. The relationship she shared with Chris was just like this waterlogged panel. They were trying to hold on to a design whose adhesive had already liquefied, trying to force pieces to stay together when the foundation beneath them had turned to slurry. To continue would be an exercise in vanity, a refusal to acknowledge that the original structure was dead. Marie's hand trembled as she reached out and took the heavy steel knife from Elena's fingers. She stood up slowly, her body aching from the cold, and stepped directly into the column of falling rain beneath the broken skylight. She raised the tool to the top of the western panel, where a beautiful sequence of amber and twilight glass still clung desperately to the wood. With a deep, shuddering breath that caught in her throat, she pressed the flat of the steel blade against the wood and pushed down with all her strength. The sound of the glass scraping against the wood was an unholy, screaming screech that echoed through the high rafters of the loft. Dozens of hours of precise, meticulous creation came away in a single, violent motion, falling into the dark water at her feet with a chaotic clatter. Marie didn't stop. She worked with a frenzied, desperate energy, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged white gasps as she stripped the board clean, erasing every memory of the design she had built. Elena stood just outside the spray of the water, watching the demolition with a grim, silent approval. When the panel was finally bare, nothing remained but the rough, dark grain of the wood, scarred by the steel knife and dripping with grey water, an empty canvas waiting for a future that neither woman could yet see in the gathering dark. Chapter 8, The Residue of High Tides. The storm broke over the coastal city in the deep hours before dawn, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum and a silence that felt heavy, waterlogged, and unnatural. The violent gale had vanished as suddenly as it had arrived, but the physical wreckage of its passage lay strewn across every surface of the old quarter. Seaweed clung to the rusted iron street lamps along the harbor mains, and puddles of salt water mirrored the pale, cold violet of the morning sky. Chris walked up the cliffside path toward the apartment, his boots heavy with the gray silt of the customs house cellars. His muscles were rigid with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion after a night spent swinging an iron sledgehammer into ancient masonry, fighting the rising tide alongside Julian and Clara until their arms had turned to lead. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a survivor, his eyes fixed on the flagstones beneath his feet. The customs house had been saved, its foundations temporarily stabilized by the brutal diversion of the floodwater, but the victory felt utterly hollow as he approached his own front door. He carried the scent of the disaster home with him, a pervasive, sharp aroma of wet lime, old river mud, and the metallic tang of sweat-soaked wool. When he reached the threshold, he paused, his hand hovering over the cold brass latch for a long count of 10. He was bracing himself not for a conflict, but for the predictable, crushing weight of the domestic quiet that waited on the other side of the timber panel. When he stepped into the entryway, the apartment was cast in an unearthly, dim twilight. The storm had left its signature here too, the dark stain of water that had seeped under the northern window sill had grown into a wide, jagged continent across the hardwood floorboards, its edges dry now, leaving a crust of white salt deposits in the grain of the wood. Across the room, Marie sat at the heavy oak dining table, her posture perfectly matching the stillness of the furniture. She was wrapped in her oversized woolen cardigan, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring blankly out at the Atlantic Ocean, which had returned to a deceptive, flat calm of slate gray and indigo. She did not turn her head when the door clicked shut. She had been sitting in that exact position for hours, watching the transition from dark to light, her mind still echoing with the terrible, screaming screech of the steel palette knife scraping her life's work into the mud. The floor of her studio was currently littered with thousands of hours of ruined, shattered glass, but she had brought nothing back with her, no tote bag of fragments, no sketches, no tools. Her hands lay flat on the table before her, completely bare, the skin raw and stripped of its creative armor, the small adhesive bandage on her thumb now gray and fraying at the edges. Chris moved into the room like a ghost navigating a graveyard, his movements careful, trying to minimize the sound of his heavy, mud-caked boots against the floor. He walked to the kitchen island and set his keys down with a tiny, metallic ring that seemed to vibrate through the entire apartment. He looked at Marie's profile, noticing the faint purple shadows beneath her eyes, the sharp angle of her jawline, and the absolute lack of movement in her frame. He saw her bare, wounded hands on the oak table and felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, a profound wave of recognition that she had suffered her own structural collapse while he was away fighting his. Yet, despite the mutual recognition of their exhaustion, the invisible wall between them remained completely intact, its stones laid with the mortar of 10 years of accumulation. Chris wanted to drop his mud-stained coat to the floor, to walk over to her, to fall to his knees beside her chair and bury his face in her lap, letting the weight of his fatigue finally break through his professional composure. He wanted to tell her about the terrifying roar of the water in the lower vaults, about the effortless, unburdened way Clara had looked at him in the circle of halogen light, and the terrifying guilt that had accompanied that moment of clarity. He wanted to ask her what had happened in her studio to leave her hands so empty and her eyes so hollow. But the inertia of their long-form silence was absolute. To speak now would be to invite a flood that neither of them had the structural engineering to contain. It would mean admitting that the design of their life together had become a compromise, a beautiful structure built on a foundation that had slowly turned to slurry over years of unexpressed griefs and separate ambitions. So instead of moving toward her, Chris remained standing by the kitchen island, his fingers gripping the edge of the marble countertop until his knuckles turned as white as the salt crust on the floorboards. Marie watched his reflection in the vast glass windowpane before her. She saw the gray lime dust that coated his shoulders like snow, the dark mud on his trousers, and the heavy, slouched defeat in his posture. She knew he had spent the night saving someone else's history, throwing his entire physical strength into preserving a building that was centuries older than their love. She felt a bittersweet, melancholic pride in his determination, but it was immediately swallowed by a dark, chilling realization. Chris was a man who could fix anything made of stone and iron, but he was completely blind to the fact that the woman sitting 3 yards away from him was dissolving from the inside out. She thought of Elena sitting in the dark studio, watching the destruction of the mosaic with the cold approval of a woman who had long since traded human intimacy for the absolute, unyielding clarity of her art. Marie looked down at her bare fingers, feeling the sting of the tiny glass cuts in her skin. She realized with a dull, terrifying certainty that she had already begun the clean scrape of her own life. The storm had broken the skylight and melted the adhesive of her artwork, but it was her own hand that had driven the steel blade across the board, erasing the design entirely. The emptiness she felt now was not an accident, it was a space she had violently cleared herself, and as she looked at the reflection of the husband who could not reach her through the quiet, she wondered if there was anything left of their foundation worth rebuilding from the shards. The kitchen clock struck 6, its mechanical chime breaking the silver stagnation of the room. It was the signal for the day to begin, for the routines to resume, for the masks to be fastened back into place. Marie rose slowly from the table, her bare feet making no sound against the floor as she walked toward the bathroom to wash the gray grout from her skin. Chris watched her go, his eyes tracking the slow, elegant curve of her shoulders until the door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, leaving him alone in the pale violet light of a morning that offered no warmth, surrounded by the flawless, silent ruins of their domestic horizon. Chapter 9, The Pale Horizon of Realignment. The post-storm reality of the harbor district was defined by a harsh, sterile clarity. The rain had washed away weeks of accumulated city soot, leaving the granite facades of the warehouses looking raw and exposed under a pale, bleached sky that offered no heat. Chris stood on the upper scaffolding of the customs house atrium, 20 feet above the stone floor, his boots locked onto the narrow timber planks. In his gloved hands, he held a heavy pneumatic grouting pump, its rhythmic, mechanical thudding vibrating through his chest as he injected liquid lime stabilizer deep into the dark fissures of the western support arch. The machine's pulse was steady, monotonous, and predictable, a brutal comfort that occupied his hands while his mind drifted through the silent spaces of his life. Below him, on the floor of the atrium, Julian moved through the shadows with methodical focus. He was setting up a series of electronic laser levels, adjusting the brass dials on a tripod until a razor-thin beam of brilliant red light shot across the expanse of the room, striking the center of the compromised archway. The laser did not lie, it provided a flawless, glowing metric of the building's current state of alignment. Julian stood by the tripod, his arms crossed over his leather tool vest, tracking the tiny red dot as it wavered slightly against the rough limestone before settling. He gave Chris a single, sharp thumbs up from the shadows, a silent confirmation that the structural shift had been arrested, that the steel shore props and the previous night's desperate excavations had successfully anchored the building against the gravity of its own ruin. Chris did not celebrate the success. He kept his eyes fixed on the point where the dark liquid cement was seeping from the cracks, wiping away the excess with a steel trowel before it could harden onto the historic face of the stone. He felt an intense, crushing weariness that had nothing to do with the physical labor. He had spent the morning restoring the vertical truth of an ancient monument, but the truth of his own existence remained terrifyingly skewed. Every measurement he took here reminded him of the complete lack of instruments available to calculate the drift occurring at home. The heavy iron doors at the entrance creaked open, admitting a sudden influx of the cold harbor air and the sharp, rapid clicking of footsteps. Clara stepped into the atrium, her oversized leather folder tucked under her arm, her bright yellow slicker from the night before replaced by a simple, ink-stained canvas jacket. She did not stop at the makeshift plywood table, instead, she walked directly to the base of the scaffolding, looking up at Chris through the maze of iron pipes and timber crossbeams. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, but her eyes held that same sharp, uncompromised curiosity that had fascinated him during the height of the flood. She set her folder down on a stack of historic bricks and pulled out a clean, freshly drafted schematic of the building's secondary foundation piers. It was a new blueprint she had spent the dawn hours creating, integrating the forgotten 17th-century drainage maps with Chris's modern engineering plans. She didn't call up to him, she simply taped the large sheet of paper to the side of a vertical steel support column at eye level, ensuring it was visible to him from his high perch. She pointed to a specific intersection of lines at the base of the drawing, a newly designed concrete retaining wall that would permanently isolate the ancient drainage culvert from the sea. Chris stopped the pneumatic pump, letting the mechanical roar die away into a sudden, echoing quiet. He climbed down the iron ladder, his movements stiff and deliberate, until he stood beside Clara in the cold light of the atrium. They leaned over the new drawing together, their eyes tracing the clean black ink lines. Clara's fingers moved across the paper with absolute confidence, pointing out the precise coordinates where the new foundations would tie into the old stone. Chris watched her hand, noting the neatness of her drawings, the absence of doubt in her layout. Standing so close to her, Chris felt that same dangerous, intoxicating sensation of lightness that had troubled him during the storm. With Clara, the world was a series of solvable equations. She brought him history, but it was a history that could be catalogued, mapped, and corrected with modern engineering. There were no hidden resentments in her pages, no years of accumulated quiet, no expectations of a love that had already begun to turn to ash. Her presence was like a clear, unburdened horizon, a glimpse of a life where the foundations didn't carry the crushing weight of a decade's worth of unexpressed grief. He looked up from the blueprint to her face, catching her eye for a brief, suspended second. Clara did not look away, her expression was steady, searching, and laced with a quiet understanding of his distraction that made his heart twist with a profound, terrifying sense of guilt. He turned away from her abruptly, picking up his trowel and his bucket of mortar, using the physical necessity of his work to build a wall between himself and the lightness she offered. Julian watched the interaction from across the room, his laser level still casting its brilliant red line across the dark limestone, his silent posture a grave, wordless warning that Chris understood all too well. By the time the midday sun reached its zenith, casting a flat, shadowless glare through the high windows of the customs house, Chris was back on the upper scaffolding. He worked with a furious, unyielding intensity, driving the mortar deep into the stone, trying to bury his thoughts beneath the weight of the ancient masonry. He had found the hidden source of the building's decay, and he knew exactly how to fix it with concrete and iron. But as he looked down at Clara, who was now sitting quietly at the plywood table, her head bowed over her research books, he knew that the real collapse was not happening here in the Port District. It was waiting for him on the cliffs, in an apartment filled with silver light and broken glass, where the woman he loved was standing on the precipice of an emptiness he had no idea how to bridge. Chapter 10, The Horizon of Bare Wood. The cold mid-afternoon light cutting through the newly boarded skylight of the studio was flat, sterile, and unyielding. It offered no warmth to the high-ceilinged loft, illuminating only the absolute emptiness that had become Marie's world. In the center of the vast space stood the heavy plywood easel, its surface now completely bare, stripped clean of every fragment of the twilight-colored Venetian glass she had painstakingly placed over the preceding weeks. The wood was deeply scarred, marked by the violent, horizontal gouges left behind by her steel palette knife during the frantic demolition of the previous day. A faint, chalky residue of dried cement clung to the edges of the grain-like salt deposits left behind by a receding tide, a ghostly outline of a design that no longer existed. Marie stood a few paces back from the easel, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her ink-stained apron, her body completely rigid. She stared at the empty board as if she were looking at an open grave. The creative momentum that had sustained her for a decade felt entirely depleted, replaced by a profound, heavy inertia that made even the act of breathing feel like a conscious effort. On her workbench lay a fresh, untouched block of gray volcanic mortar and several unopened wooden boxes of imported stained glass, vibrant crimsons, pale opals, and deep, liquid greens. They were brilliant, full of potential, yet she could not bring herself to lift the lid. To begin a new layout required a belief in a future design, a conviction that the pieces could hold together, and that was a resource she no longer possessed. In her corner of the studio, shrouded in the long shadows of the late afternoon, Elena sat perfectly motionless in her velvet armchair. A fresh unlit cigarette was held between her long, liver-spotted fingers, her severe profile looking as sharp and uncompromising as a piece of chipped flint. She had not offered a single word of comfort since Marie had arrived that morning, nor had she helped clear away the thousands of ruined glass shards that still littered the floorboards beneath the easel. Elena remained a silent, watchful sentinel, her hooded eyes tracking the younger woman's paralysis with a cold, analytical detach. She was waiting to see if the destruction had broken Marie's spirit completely, or if it had cleared away the remaining illusions that bound her to her domestic life. Marie moved slowly toward the workbench, her bare feet tracking through the fine gray dust that coated the floor. She lifted her steel-wheeled nippers, her fingers wrapping around the cold iron handles with a practiced, muscle-memory familiarity. She picked up a small block of the crimson glass, holding it up to the pale light of the window. The color was magnificent, the shade of an open vein, vivid and violent, but as she brought the blades of the tool against the edge of the glass, her hand began to tremble. The sharp, explosive crack of the medium breaking, which had once been a sound of liberation and creation, now felt like a physical assault against her nerves. She set the tool down with a quiet, hollow clatter, her head bowing as she pressed her forehead against the cool, hard surface of the wooden bench. The silence in the studio was not merely the absence of sound, it was a dense, suffocating presence that mirrored the atmospheric stagnation of her apartment on the cliffs. Her thoughts drifted across the city to Chris, picturing him on his high scaffolding at the customs house, surrounded by his laser levels and pneumatic pumps, systematically injecting strength back into stones that were centuries older than their marriage. She felt a bitter, agonizing envy for his world, a world where structural failure could be diagnosed with blueprints and solved with raw concrete. In her world, the adhesive had failed, the charcoal lines had dissolved into slurry, and there were no engineering manuals to explain how to rebuild a shared life once the common vision had been entirely erased. Elena rose from her chair with a slow, deliberate grace, her heavy fur coat rustling in the quiet room. She walked toward the easel, her hands clasped loosely behind her severe back, stopping just inches from the scarred wooden panel. Without looking at Marie, Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of pure black obsidian glass, a fragment from her own personal archive, unpolished and fiercely sharp. She did not place it on the board, instead, she laid it flat on the edge of Marie's workbench, right beside the trembling crimson piece, before stepping back into the shadows. The black glass was a silent, devastating testament. It was the color of total isolation, the medium of a woman who had stripped away every human compromise to ensure her art remained absolute and unbothered by the vulnerability of love. Marie looked from the obsidian shard to Elena's retreating silhouette, and a cold dread settled deep in her stomach. She realized that the empty plywood panel before her was not just a ruined artwork, it was the pale, blank horizon of her own future. The storm had broken her design, but it was her own hand that had completed the demolition, and as she stood alone in the dying light of the afternoon, she knew that the second movement of her life had begun, a movement defined not by the beauty of what she could build, but by the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. Chapter 11, The Stagnation of Midsummer. The transition into the high, suffocating heat of July brought no relief to the coastal city, it merely baked the dampness of the spring storms into a heavy, permanent haze that hung over the harbor like a wet shroud. The crisp silver dawn of earlier months had been replaced by a stagnant, brassy glare that flattened the horizon and turned the Atlantic into a smooth, oil-slicked mirror of heat. Inside the cliffside apartment, the air was dense and completely motionless. The panoramic windows were thrown wide to the terrace, but no breeze entered, leaving the interior trapped in a silent, humid suspension. Chris sat at the heavy oak table, his dark canvas trousers swapped for lighter linen, though his posture remained just as rigid as it had been during the winter freezes. Before him lay a glass of iced water, the condensation gathering on the outer surface in large, sluggish tears that tracked down the glass and pooled on the wood below. He watched the moisture accumulate, his fingers resting inches from the base, completely unmoving. The city's historic district was entering its peak tourist season, and his days at the customs house were long, loud, and exhausting. Yet, the physical labor under the hot sun felt strangely distant compared to the immediate, crushing density of the silence that awaited him every evening within these walls. Across the room, Marie stood near the kitchen island, her back to him as she washed a small basket of summer fruit. The sound of the running water was a thin, solitary thread of noise in the vast quiet of the apartment. She moved with an agonizing slowness, her fingers gently rubbing the skin of a dark plum, her mind completely detached from the physical action. Her studio remained an active battlefield of empty space. Since the day she had scraped the waterlogged mosaic clean, she had managed only to mount a few stark, geometric borders around the perimeter of the bare wood. The vibrant crimsons and deep greens she had purchased remained sealed in their crates. She had chosen instead to work exclusively with the black obsidian glass Elena had left on her workbench, a material that absorbed the summer light rather than reflecting it. The distance between them had solidified into something structural, a permanent monument of unexpressed griefs and separate realities that occupied the very center of the room. They no longer had to actively maintain the silence, it had developed its own gravity, pulling them into separate orbits. Chris looked at the curve of her shoulders, noting how the oppressive heat seemed to make her posture even more defensive. He thought of his afternoon at the site, spent in the cool, subterranean shadow of the customs house vaults alongside Julian and Clara. The excavation of the ancient foundations was nearly complete, the concrete retaining walls setting perfectly in the heat. Clara had been there, her linen shirt stained with gray dust, her voice full of a bright, immediate energy as she presented the final structural reports. That interaction had been easy, a simple line drawn between 2 points of focus, completely free of the historic sediment that clogged every breath in this apartment. Marie turned off the tap, the sudden cessation of the running water causing the silence to snap back into place with the force of a physical blow. She did not bring the fruit to the table. Instead, she carried the small ceramic bowl to the open terrace doors, standing on the threshold where the heat of the stone floor met the heavy air of the interior. She looked out at the slate-gray ocean, watching a lone fishing vessel crawl across the brassy horizon, its wake a white, disappearing line on the water. She knew Chris was watching her, she could feel the weight of his gaze like a hand pressing against the small of her back. It was a gaze full of an unvocalized plea for connection, yet laced with a growing, defensive frustration that matched her own. They were two people trapped in the third movement of their history, an era defined not by explosive arguments or dramatic confrontations, but by the terrifying weight of what was being withheld. Marie looked down at her hands, where the small cuts from the obsidian glass were healing into thin, silvery lines. She wanted to turn around, to cross the room, to pour the bowl of cold water over his head or smash the ceramic against the floorboards, anything to break the flawless, suffocating architecture of their quiet. But the momentum of their collective hesitation was absolute. To break the silence now would require an admission of how much had already been destroyed, a confession that the design they had built over a decade was no longer capable of sheltering them. Chris rose from the table, his chair making a brief, muted scrape against the hardwood that seemed to echo for minutes in the hot room. He did not approach the terrace. Instead, he walked to the entryway, picked up his leather measuring tape and his notebook from the bench, and moved toward the secondary door that led to his small home office. He needed the sanctuary of his drawings, the comfort of clean black ink lines on white paper where errors could be erased with a steady stroke of a razor blade. As the door of his office clicked shut, Marie let out a slow, shuddering breath that she had been holding in her chest since he first moved, her eyes closing against the flat, blinding glare of the summer sea. Chapter 12, The Geometry of Isolation. The midsummer heatwave transformed the studio into a breathless, wood-scented oven. The vast skylight, though covered in a thick layer of white solar-reflective paint, acted as a massive lens, trapping the heavy, dust-mote-filled air until the rafters radiated a dull, oppressive warmth. The smell of linseed oil, dry cement mortar, and old paper was thick and cloying, sticking to the back of the throat. Marie sat on her high iron stool before the easel, her hair pinned up loosely with a broken charcoal pencil, her forehead slick with a fine sheen of perspiration. On the plywood board, the new project was beginning to take a definite, chilling shape. She was no longer trying to recreate the soft, fluid seascapes or the delicate twilight horizons that had characterized her earlier work. Instead, her hands were locked into a harsh, geometric discipline. She was using the jagged pieces of black obsidian glass to construct a series of sharp, concentric triangles that radiated outward from a tiny, empty center. The lines were aggressive, unyielding, and defensively precise. Each shard was placed with an absolute, heavy pressure, forced into the thick, dark volcanic mortar until the gray paste oozed up between the cracks like ash from a volcanic fissure. Elena sat in her usual corner, the heavy velvet armchair pushed deep into the only patch of shade left in the loft. She had abandoned her wool blankets for a fan of dark ebony wood, which she moved with a rhythmic, mesmerizing flick of her wrist. The soft, dry rustle of the fan was the only consistent sound in the room, a steady pulse that seemed to measure the slow evaporation of Marie's energy. Elena watched the development of the geometric design with a cold, triumphant satisfaction. She recognized the pattern. It was the architecture of self-preservation, the visual language of an artist who was systematically building a wall around her own vulnerabilities. The fluid, collaborative spirit that Chris had brought into Marie's life was being systematically cut away, piece by sharp black piece. Marie picked up her iron nippers, her blistered fingers wrapping around the metal handles. She selected a long, slender splinter of the obsidian, holding it down against the leather anvil block. With a sharp, practiced squeeze, she snapped the glass into 3 distinct, needle-like fragments. The sound was a miniature explosion in the hot quiet, a brittle report that seemed to vibrate inside her teeth. She took the sharpest piece and pressed it into the outermost ring of the mosaic, her thumb pushing so hard against the glass that the skin turned bloodless and white. A tiny, microscopic edge of the shard caught the corner of her thumb, leaving a perfect, bead-sized drop of crimson against the dark stone. She did not flinch, nor did she stop to wipe it away, she simply watched as the dark mortar absorbed the moisture, binding it permanently into the structure. Her mind drifted back to the small apartment on the cliff, where the silence had become an active, suffocating entity. The night before, she had watched Chris from across the dark hallway as he cleaned his engineering instruments. He had been meticulous, wiping down the brass calipers and the steel T-squares with an oily cloth, his movements full of a quiet, defensive intensity that mirrored her own work here at the easel. They were both retreaters, both building separate fortresses out of the materials they understood best. He had his calculations, his concrete retaining walls, and his clean, logical blueprints. She had her volcanic ash, her steel nippers, and her unyielding black glass. They were no longer a couple sharing a crisis, they were 2 distinct entities working in parallel, each preparing for a solitary survival. Elena's fan stopped its rhythmic clicking. The older woman stood up, her long black silk dress trailing through the gray dust as she approached the easel. She stood just behind Marie's shoulder, her breath smelling faintly of dried mint as she examined the new mosaic. She reached out a single, wrinkled finger, her long fingernail lightly tracing the sharp perimeter of the outermost triangle. She did not offer a nod of approval, such gestures were foreign to her, but she left her hand resting on the top of the easel for a long moment, a heavy, symbolic anchor that validated the defensive nature of the work. Marie looked at the reflection of her own tired face in the polished facets of the obsidian. The glass did not allow the light to pass through it, it acted as a dark, flawless mirror, throwing back the image of the studio, the white heat of the skylight, and the severe, watchful shadow of Elena standing behind her. The soft, luminous colors of her past life, the pale opals, the sea greens, the warm ambers that had once reminded her of the light in Chris's eyes, lay forgotten in their wooden crates beneath the workbench. As the sun began its long, slow descent toward the western hills, casting elongated, distorted shadows across the floorboards, Marie picked up another piece of the black glass. She knew that this design would never shelter anyone else, that it was built to exclude the world, yet she drove it into the mortar with a fierce, desperate certainty, welcoming the cold, impenetrable isolation it promised. Chapter 13, The Meridian of Dust. The high summer heat reached its absolute zenith over the harbor district, turning the customs house into a vast kiln of brick and limestone. Outside, the cobblestones radiated a shimmering, distorting glare that made the masts of the fishing vessels in the basin appear to warp against the white-hot sky. Inside the central atrium, the air was totally stagnant, thick with the dry, powdery taste of pulverized mortar and old lime dust that suspended itself in the long, blinding shafts of sunlight. The coolness that had once characterized the building's lower vaults had been entirely burned away, replaced by a heavy, breathless warmth that clung to the skin like a wet cloth. Chris worked on the lower foundations of the western archway, his body soaked in sweat, his linen shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest and streaked with dark gray cement paste. He was kneeling on a rubber mat on the stone floor, using a heavy cold chisel and a steel mallet to clear away the stubborn, calcified deposits from the 17th century drainage culvert. Each blow of the mallet sent a sharp, metallic ring echoing upward into the high timber rafters, followed by the soft, dry rattle of crumbling stone. The work was brutal, repetitive, and exhausting, yet he drove himself into it with a desperate, punishing intensity, using the physical strain to drown out the persistent, quiet panic that had taken root in his mind. A few feet away, Julian was managing the heavy mixer, his broad shoulders coated in a fine layer of white stone dust that made him look like a statue brought to life. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of effort, lifting the heavy paper bags of sand and tipping them into the rotating iron drum, his expressions completely unreadable behind his protective goggles. He didn't look at Chris, but the steady, rhythmic clanking of the mixer provided a mechanical counterpoint to Chris's erratic hammering. It was a silent partnership born of years of shared labor, yet today, the silence between them felt heavy, laden with an unspoken judgment that Chris was too tired to challenge. The heavy iron doors at the harbor entrance opened with a long, groaning scrape, admitting a sudden swirl of hot, salty air and the rapid, precise sound of boot heels on stone. Clara stepped into the atrium, carrying a fresh roll of drafted site reports and a small, sweat-dampened towel. She had spent the morning at the municipal archives, tracking down the original land grants for the port district, and her face was flushed from the walk across the baking docks. She did not stop at the plywood layout table, instead, she walked directly to the trench where Chris was working, unrolling the large blueprint across a stack of dry bricks right beside his knee. Chris lowered his mallet, the sudden cessation of his hammering leaving a ringing void in the air. He wiped his forearm across his sweat-streaked forehead, leaving a dark smudge of lime across his brow, and looked down at the paper. Clara's drawings were immaculate, detailed with a delicate, fine-pointed ink that seemed impossibly precise compared to the raw, crumbling stone around them. She pointed to a section of the old harbor wall, showing a newly discovered subterranean structural buttress that had been omitted from all modern maps. Her hand was steady, her fingers moving along the lines with a quiet, absolute enthusiasm that seemed entirely untouched by the oppressive heat of the room. As Chris leaned closer to examine the drawing, his shoulder brushed against hers, a brief, accidental contact that felt shockingly electric against the dull numbness of his day. Clara did not pull away immediately, she remained still for a second, her eyes fixed on the blueprint, though her breathing changed, becoming slightly faster in the hot quiet. In that brief, suspended moment, Chris was acutely aware of the contrast between this trench and his home life. Here, with Clara, every problem had a historical context and a logical, physical solution. The air between them was filled with dust and heat, but it was free of the suffocating, decade-long sediment of unexpressed resentments that filled his apartment on the cliff. With Clara, he wasn't a husband failing a silent test, he was simply a builder helping to save a monument from the sea. The realization brought with it a sudden, crushing wave of guilt that made him pull back, his boots scraping loudly against the stone floor. He looked up toward the mixing station, where Julian had stopped the iron drum. Julian was standing perfectly still, his hands resting on the frame of the machine, his dark eyes watching Chris through the dusty glass of his goggles with a flat, unwavering gravity. There was no anger in Julian's posture, only a deep, historical knowledge of Chris's life and a silent, wordless warning about the fragility of foundations, both architectural and emotional. Chris turned back to the blueprint, his fingers tracing the outline of the subterranean buttress with a sudden, forced focus. He picked up his charcoal pencil and made a sharp, heavy mark on the paper, indicating where they would need to inject the first stabilization piers. Clara watched his hand, her expression softening into a quiet, searching look that seemed to see right through his defensive professionalism. She rolled up the blueprint slowly, her movements deliberate, before walking back toward the light of the entryway, leaving him alone in the hot shadow of the archway. Chris picked up his mallet and chisel once more, his grip so tight his knuckles turned bloodless beneath the gray dust. He brought the steel down against the stone with a sudden, violent force, a loud, fracturing crack that shattered the stillness of the atrium. He knew that the structural reinforcement of the customs house was nearing completion, that the ancient stone would hold against the tide. But as he stared into the dark, cleared opening of the drainage culvert, he felt a profound, terrifying certainty that his own internal structure was fracturing beyond repair, and that the modern tools he relied upon were completely useless against the rising, silent water of his life. Chapter 14, The Geography of the Table. The late August dusk settled over the cliffs like a heavy, purple bruise, offering no relief from the accumulated heat of the summer. Outside, the Atlantic was completely flat, its surface a dull, leaden sheet that seemed to absorb the remaining light without reflecting it. Inside the apartment, the air was dense and motionless, smelling faintly of the sea salt baking on the terrace stone and the sharp, chemical tang of the volcanic cement Marie had carried home on her clothes. The panoramic windows were fully retracted, yet the boundary between the interior space and the vast, empty horizon had completely dissolved, leaving the rooms feeling exposed, hollow, and strangely adrift. Chris sat at the western end of the long oak dining table, his back to the dark interior of the kitchen. Before him sat a simple plate of cold summer vegetables and bread, untouched. The linen placemat beneath his hands was white, crisp, and perfectly square, its neat geometric lines providing a small, fragile island of order in the room. He kept his eyes fixed downward, tracing the intricate, winding grain of the ancient timber table. Over the years, this surface had been stained by wine, nicked by dropped keys, and polished by the smooth palms of their hands during early morning coffees. Now, those marks felt like the archaeological ruins of a civilization that had vanished, buried beneath the invisible, suffocating weight of everything they could no longer say to one another. At the eastern end of the table, separated from him by 6 feet of polished, empty wood, Marie sat with her profile turned toward the sea. Her hands were folded loosely in her lap, her fingers occasionally tracing the thin, silver scars left by the obsidian glass she had been cutting all afternoon. She had not touched her food either. A single candle stood in the exact center of the table, its flame perfectly vertical and completely still in the dead air. The small, yellow light did not illuminate their faces, instead, it cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floorboards, meeting in a dark tangle behind the chairs like two distinct entities trying to connect where their owners could not. The distance between them was no longer just an emotional abstraction, it had become a physical, geographic reality that governed every movement in the apartment. To pass a salt cellar or to reach for the water pitcher would require a disruption of the delicate, hostile equilibrium they had established over the summer months. Every silent gesture was calculated to avoid a collision. When Chris finally raised his hand to lift his water glass, his movements were agonizingly slow, his fingers careful to prevent the glass from clicking against the ceramic plate. The sound of a single drop of water hitting the wood felt as loud as a hammer blow in the immense quiet, a sudden, sharp report that made Marie's shoulders tighten. Marie turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting from the dark ocean to the white rectangle of Chris's placemat. In the dim candlelight, his features looked sharp, exhausted, and deeply lined with the dust of the customs house. She could see the faint gray outline of cement paste still clinging to the skin beneath his fingernails, a reminder of the physical walls he spent his days reinforcing. She knew, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that he was no longer fully present in this room. The silence that wrapped around him was no longer just a defensive retreat from her, it was a sanctuary he was choosing, a space populated by the clean, solvable problems of ancient stone and the unburdened, immediate clarity of his work with Clara. The thought did not spark anger, it merely deepened the cold, hollow certainty that the foundation of their life had eroded past the point of structural rescue. Chris looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small, flickering candle flame. For a single, suspended second, the defensive armor of their daily routine slipped away, leaving only the raw, exposed truth of their mutual estrangement. There was no hatred in the look, no lingering resentment from old arguments, only a profound, crushing sorrow for the beauty of the design they had lost. He wanted to reach across the vast expanse of the oak table, to bury his hands in the fabric of her apron and pull her back from the edge of the dark horizon she was staring at. But the momentum of their collective hesitation was absolute. The 6 feet of empty wood between them might as well have been the entire width of the Atlantic basin. To speak now, to break the flawless, suffocating architecture of their silence, would be to invite the final, catastrophic collapse of the roof over their heads. Marie rose from her chair first, her movements fluid and entirely silent. She did not clear her plate or blow out the candle, she simply turned away from the table and walked toward the open terrace, her figure dissolving into the deep purple shadows of the coastal night. Chris remained at the table for a long time, watching the wax of the candle melt and pool on the white linen placemat, his body perfectly still as the dark, silent water of their shared history rose up to submerge the room. Chapter 15, The Threshold of Obsidian. The first true gale of September arrived at twilight, driving a wedge of cold, northern air across the coastal basin and shattering the long stagnation of the summer heatwave. Outside, the harbor waters turned a dark, violent slate gray, their white-capped peaks churning against the stone breakwaters. Inside the high loft, the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure caused the heavy timbers of the rafters to groan in protest. The wind rattled the large overhead skylight, sending a frantic, erratic pattern of shadows dancing across the floorboards as the dry autumn leaves from the street below scraped against the brick walls like fingernails. In the center of the room, the massive plywood easel held the completed mosaic. It was a monument to absolute exclusion. The sharp, concentric triangles of black obsidian glass had been driven so deeply into the dark volcanic mortar that the entire surface resembled a fractured shield of volcanic rock. The design possessed no windows, no openings, and no gradient of tone, it was an impenetrable vortex of polished black facets that caught the fading twilight and twisted it into sharp, needle-like glints of silver. The pale opals, the sea greens, and the warm ambers that had once defined Marie's artistic identity remained entirely absent, sealed away in the dust-covered wooden crates beneath her workbench like artifacts from a buried life. Elena stood directly in front of the mosaic, her long black silk skirts perfectly still despite the draft that whistled through the gaps in the window frame. She had abandoned her ebony fan, her hands now clasped loosely in front of her severe waist as she leaned forward to inspect the final perimeter lines. Her sharp profile was illuminated by the dying orange glare of the sun setting behind the western ridge. She reached out a single, thin finger, her long nail clicking sharply against the razor-edged point of the central triangle. The sound was high, brittle, and definitive, a declaration of completion. She turned her hooded eyes toward Marie, her expression a mix of cold validation and predatory expectation, waiting for the final transition to occur. Marie sat on the low iron stool a few paces back, her arms wrapped tightly across her chest, her canvas apron stiff with dried gray mortar. Her fingers were raw, the skin crisscrossed with thin, dark lines where the volcanic dust had settled into the healing cuts left by the obsidian. She looked at her creation and felt a profound, hollow sense of finality. The work was flawless in its defenses, it was a structure that could never be compromised by water, heat, or the slow, grinding shifts of an unyielding foundation. Yet, as she stared into the dark, reflective facets of the glass, she did not see a triumph of artistic liberation. She saw only the total, irreversible erasure of her past. The mosaic was a mirror that threw back nothing but her own isolation and the severe, watchful shadow of the older woman standing beside her. Her thoughts traveled down the cliffside road to the apartment, where the long oak table and the white square placemat still held the memory of their silent, late August dinner. She knew that Chris was likely standing on the terrace at this very moment, his face turned toward the oncoming storm, his mind occupied by the structural victory at the customs house. He had reinforced his stones, she had shattered her glass. They had both successfully built their fortresses against the rising tide, yet the walls they had constructed were designed to keep each other out. The third movement of their life had reached its logical, devastating conclusion, the weight of the unspoken things had become too heavy for the floorboards to bear, and the architecture of their silence was now a permanent prison. Elena moved away from the easel with a slow, deliberate grace, her heavy boots tracking through the fine stone dust as she walked toward the high entry doors of the loft. She did not look back at Marie, nor did she offer a parting gesture. She simply pulled the massive iron handle, leaving the door unlatched behind her as she stepped out into the cold, wind-swept stairwell. The sudden influx of air caused the single work lamp over the bench to swing wildly on its cord, its harsh light sweeping across the bare wooden walls and the sharp black surface of the completed mosaic like a searchlight over a ruin. Marie rose from her stool, her movements stiff and heavy with an immense, spiritual exhaustion. She walked to the open door, looking out into the dark hallway where Elena's footsteps were already fading into the lower floors of the building. She looked back at her workbench, at the steel nippers and the empty mortar troughs, and knew that a fundamental threshold had been crossed. The design of her marriage was gone, replaced by the rigid, unyielding geometry of the obsidian before her. She reached out and slowly clicked off the overhead lamp, plunging the studio into total darkness, leaving only the wild, cold autumn wind to howl against the glass above her head. Chapter 16: The Convergence of the Basin. The equinoctial gales of late September transformed the harbor district into a churning, waterlogged combat zone. A massive atmospheric low-pressure system had stalled directly over the bay, locking its teeth into the coastline and driving an unprecedented high tide, a true king tide, deep into the city's vulnerable maritime throat. By mid-afternoon, the black Atlantic had breached the granite outer breakwaters, sending thick, oily swells spilling over the cobblestone wharves to drown the lower lanes in 2 feet of swirling, debris-strewn foam. The sky above was a low, bruised purple canvas of fast-moving scud that seemed to touch the very masts of the trapped fishing vessels. Inside the central atrium of the customs house, the situation had reached a critical, terrifying structural threshold. The ancient 17th-century drainage culvert, which Chris had spent the summer clearing and reinforcing, had become a conduit for the ocean's fury. The subterranean retaining walls he had poured were holding, but the sheer hydrostatic pressure of the rising sea was forcing water up through the very pores of the limestone floorboards and the microscopic fissures of the foundational arches. A cold, brackish mist hung in the air, smelling heavily of old rot, rusted iron, and the raw brine of the outer deep. Chris stood shoulder-deep in the flooded excavation trench beneath the western support arch, his thighs locked into the icy, waist-high water. His yellow oilskin jacket was torn at the shoulder, coated in a thick, wet slurry of gray cement and ancient silt. In his hands, he held a heavy hydraulic grout injector, its engine screaming in a high-pitched, mechanical panic as he tried to pump expanding polyurethane resin into a newly ruptured fissure at the base of the pier. The water around him was bubbling violently, a clear indication that the sea was forcing its way under the foundation timbers, threatening to liquefy the historic silt beneath the monument. Julian worked directly above him on the iron scaffolding, his face blackened by grease and stone dust. He was handling the heavy chain hoists, his massive forearms straining against the iron links as he lowered a series of heavy steel shore props into the trench to brace the leaning arch against the relentless upward thrust of the water. He didn't look down at Chris, nor did Chris look up. Their coordination was entirely mechanical, guided by the structural necessity of the moment and the rhythmic, metallic clanking of the hoists. The silence between them had been swallowed by the roaring symphony of the storm, the thudding of the waves against the exterior iron doors, the screaming of the injector engine, and the terrifying, deep-toned groaning of the building's timber frame. Clara appeared at the edge of the trench, her boots submerged in the rising floor water, her leather folder completely soaked and ruined. She held a handheld mechanical tiltmeter, its brass needle vibrating erratically as she tried to calculate the building's current rate of drift. Her dark hair was plastered to her face by the brackish mist, her expression stripped of its usual academic detachment, replaced by a raw, immediate terror. She leaned over the timber shoring, her hand reaching out to touch Chris's shoulder to draw his attention to the instrument's reading. The needle had slid past the critical red marker, the western arch was moving, tilting 2 millimeters every 10 minutes as the sea undermined its ancient bed. Chris looked from the tiltmeter to Clara's face, and in that brief, wet second, the entire illusion of his summer sanctuary collapsed. The clarity he had found in her drawings, the easy logic of their professional partnership, was entirely useless against the chaotic, unquantifiable violence of the basin. He realized that this monument could not be saved by simple calculations or concrete patches. It was an ancient thing built on shifting mud, and the sea was claiming its due. The guilt that had haunted his long walks home all summer crystallized into a cold, hard knot in his chest. He had spent months trying to reinforce this dead stone facade while the true foundation of his life, his marriage, his home, the woman he had loved for a decade, had been left to fracture in the dark on the cliffs above. A sudden, violent explosion of water erupted from the center of the trench, a geyser of black silt and brine that tore the injector from Chris's grip and sent him crashing back against the iron shoring. The primary timber prop split down the center with a sound like a rifle shot, its fibers splintering under the immense weight of the leaning stone. Julian let out a sharp, guttural heave as he wrestled with the chain hoist, trying to drop the backup steel sleeve into place before the entire western arch could slide into the excavation pit. Clara screamed, a sound instantly swallowed by the roar of the wind as she reached down to pull Chris out of the dark, swirling water. Chris scrambled up the slippery mud bank of the trench, his boots sloshing with brine, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He stood in the center of the flooded atrium, looking up at the high timber roof as the iron chandeliers swung in wide, terrifying arcs above his head. The customs house was failing, its stones shifting under the weight of the sea, mirroring the total, catastrophic realignment that was occurring within his own soul. He didn't look back at Clara or the blueprints. He turned his face toward the high western windows, looking through the salt-crusted glass toward the dark, jagged line of the cliffs where the storm was striking with its full, unmitigated fury, knowing with absolute certainty that the final convergence had begun. Chapter 17, The Fracture of the Glass Wall. The equinoctial gale struck the headland with a sustained, vibrating roar that turned the cliffside apartment into a sounding box for the Atlantic's fury. By nightfall, the atmospheric pressure had dropped to a historic low, causing the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass panels of the panoramic living room to flex and groan inward under the immense force of the wind. Outside, the world was completely erased, replaced by a blinding, horizontal sheet of salt spray and black water that lashed against the structure with the rhythmic force of a physical assault. The sea had risen so high that the spray reached the upper terrace, pooling in deep, brackish puddles that seeped beneath the metal tracks of the sliding doors. In the center of the dark dining room, Marie stood perfectly still, her silhouette illuminated only by the frantic, periodic flashes of lightning that ripped across the outer basin. She had carried the completed black obsidian mosaic down from her studio earlier that afternoon, mounting its heavy, timber-framed weight onto a heavy iron easel directly facing the seaward glass. In the erratic glare of the storm, the artwork looked less like a mosaic and more like a predatory entity. The sharp, concentric triangles of black glass absorbed the light, throwing back a fractured, chaotic mirror image of the room, the long oak table, the empty chairs, and Marie's own pale, hollow-eyed reflection twisted across a dozen razor-edged facets. The apartment was cold, the central heating entirely inadequate against the drafts that now whistled through the microscopic gaps in the window seals. The air smelled heavily of wet slate, ozone, and the sharp, vinegar-like tang of the silicone adhesive she had used to lock the final borders of the mosaic into place. Marie did not move to turn on the lamps. The electricity had been flickering for hours, a fragile, unstable current that matched the precarious equilibrium of her thoughts. She kept her hands buried in the pockets of her wool sweater, her fingers rhythmically tracing the raised, rough texture of the silver scars on her palms, her body's own matching geometry to the unyielding stone before her. A sudden, deeper vibration shuddered through the floorboards, followed by a high-pitched, terrifying crack that sounded like a rifle shot inside the room. Marie did not flinch. She looked toward the westernmost glass panel and saw a thin, hair-like fracture appear at the lower corner where the metal frame met the concrete sill. Under the immense hydrostatic pressure of the wind, the crack began to move, traveling upward across the thick pane in a slow, jagged zigzag that mirrored the lightning outside. A tiny, steady stream of black sea spray began to hiss through the fracture, atomizing into a fine, freezing mist that coated the hardwood floor in a layer of salt crust. The failure of the glass wall brought with it a strange, detached clarity that washed over her like an icy wave. For months, she and Chris had lived behind their own invisible, protective panels, maintaining a flawless, silent barrier that kept the chaos of their emotional drift at bay. They had believed that the structure would hold if they simply avoided touching it, if they kept their separate parallel routines intact. But the storm was revealing the absolute illusion of that safety. The walls they had constructed, Chris's concrete reinforcements at the harbor and her own defensive obsidian shields, were entirely useless when the ground beneath the building began to realign itself. She walked slowly toward the cracking window, her boots crunching softly on the fine salt dust that had accumulated on the floorboards. She reached out her hand, stopping it just millimeters from the vibrating glass, feeling the immense, cold pressure of the Atlantic pushing against her palm from the other side. She knew, with a sudden, devastating certainty, that Chris would not be coming home tonight to fix this frame. He was trapped in his own collapsing atrium, locked into his own desperate struggle with the rising water, trying to anchor stones that had already forgotten their purpose. They were two builders who had successfully isolated themselves from one another, only to find that their solitary fortresses had become their tombs. The lightning flashed once more, a massive, prolonged eruption of violet light that turned the room as bright as a sterile operating theater. In that brief, brilliant second, the reflection in the obsidian mosaic aligned perfectly with the jagged crack in the outer window. The two fractures seemed to merge, creating a single, continuous line of ruin that cut right through Marie's own chest. As the thunder followed with a deafening, earth-shaking detonation that made the entire cliffside tremble, she stood alone in the dark, watching the water hiss through the expanding split in the glass, waiting with a quiet, unmitigated surrender for the final barrier to give way entirely. Chapter 18, The Abandonment of the Vault. The midnight hour brought the absolute, unmitigated apex of the equinoctial deluge, converting the harbor district into an unrecognizable expanse of churning black water and screaming wind. The Atlantic had completely conquered the outer wharves, its high, oil-slicked swells rolling directly up the main avenues to smash against the lower facades of the historic warehouses with the concussive force of artillery fire. The sky above was a featureless, pitch-black void, stripped of even the jagged punctuation of lightning, leaving the world to be defined entirely by the frantic, chaotic motion of water and the deafening, industrial roar of the gale. Inside the central atrium of the customs house, the structural battle had turned into a scene of muddy, desperate devastation. The electric generator had failed an hour prior, plunging the vast space into a thick, cavernous gloom that was illuminated only by the raw, erratic sweeps of two battery-powered halogen work lamps mounted on the upper scaffolding. The cold, brackish water had risen to chest height within the central excavation trench, filling the air with a blinding, salty spray that tasted of old timber rot and the bitter, chemical tang of the useless polyurethane resin that floated on the surface in large, congealed patches. Chris was submerged to his armpits in the freezing slurry at the base of the western support arch, his fingers numb and bloodless as he tried to jam a secondary iron wedge beneath the buckling timber shoring. His yellow oilskin jacket was completely shredded, the wet canvas fabric plastered to his chest like a second skin. Every muscle in his body was trembling with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, yet his movements were driven by a frantic, irrational panic. He hammered at the iron wedge with a heavy short-handled sledge, the dull, muffled thuds of the metal against wet oak completely swallowed by the deep-toned, terrifying groaning of the limestone masonry above his head. Directly above him, standing on the slippery mud bank of the trench, Julian reached down with his massive, stone-dust-coated arms. He did not watch the arch, his eyes were fixed entirely on the shifting timber beams that braced the central vault. He saw what Chris, in his exhaustion, had failed to notice: the primary vertical shoreprop was no longer just splitting, it was twisting, its wood fibers shrieking as the entire western pier began a slow, irreversible slide into the liquefied silt of the foundation bed. Julian reached down into the dark water, his large hands wrapping around the collar of Chris's shredded jacket with an absolute, unyielding grip. He did not hesitate, he simply hoisted Chris upward out of the trench by sheer physical force, dragging his waterlogged body up onto the flooded stone floorboards just as the lower timber shoring gave way with a sound like a small cannon firing. The primary oak brace exploded into a cloud of sharp splinters, and a 3-ton section of the 17th-century foundation stone dropped into the excavation pit with a violent, deafening splash that sent a geyser of black mud hitting the high rafters. The western archway settled instantly, dropping 4 centimeters into the ruin below, its high limestone crown cracking cleanly down the center with a dry, fracturing report that echoed through the dark atrium like a death knell. Clara was standing near the eastern entryway, her handheld tiltmeter completely abandoned in the rising water at her feet. She did not attempt to retrieve her drawings, she simply watched the collapse with her arms pressed tight against her ribs, her face a pale, static mask of terror in the sweeping halogen glare. Chris lay on his back on the flooded floor, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps as the cold harbor water swirled around his ears. He looked up at the cracked crown of the archway and felt a sudden, crushing stillness settle deep inside his chest. The struggle was over. The building had made its choice, the ancient stone had forgotten its purpose, and no amount of concrete patches, iron wedges, or modern engineering calculations could force it to carry the weight of a world that had already moved on. The technical sanctuary he had built for himself over the summer months had dissolved into an icy puddle of mud and salt water. Julian stood over him, his breath coming in heavy, visible plumes in the cold air, his face blackened by grease and stone dust. He extended a hand to pull Chris to his feet, his silent, solemn posture offering no judgment, only a grave, historical acknowledgement of the inevitable ruin. He pointed toward the heavy iron doors at the entrance, which were already buckling inward under the weight of the rising harbor tide, indicating that the building was no longer safe for any living thing. Chris stood up slowly, his boots sloshing with brine, his eyes lingering for one final, devastating second on the cracked archway and the ruined blueprints floating in the dark water. He did not look back at Clara, who was already moving toward the safety of the upper street doors. He turned his face toward the western exit, his mind suddenly clearing of all structural calculations, replaced by a sharp, terrifying certainty. He had spent the entire year trying to anchor a dead monument to the sea while the true house of his life, the cliffside apartment and the woman who held the design of his soul, was fracturing alone in the dark above the basin. He tore his arm away from Julian's support and lunged out into the screaming midnight gale, his body driving forward into the flooding streets, running blindly toward the cliffs with the desperate, final hope that he might arrive before the roof fell in completely. Chapter 19, The Collapse of the Invisible Boundary. The midnight hour brought no relief to the headland, only an escalation of the storm's violence into something absolute and apocalyptic. The wind had ceased to sound like a gale, it had become a steady, deafening hum that shook the very bedrock of the cliffside apartment. The black Atlantic, swollen by the historic king tide, threw its massive swells directly against the lower shelf of the promontory, sending shockwaves through the floorboards that made the ceramic plates in the kitchen cabinets rattle in their stacks. The horizontal sheet of sea spray was so thick that the terrace outside had vanished entirely, replaced by a churning, white wall of foam that clawed at the remaining structures of the house. In the center of the dark living room, the panoramic glass wall was entering its final, catastrophic stage of failure. The initial hair-like fracture at the base of the western panel had grown into an intricate, glittering spiderweb of ruin that covered the entire pane. The thick glass was bowing inward under the immense hydrostatic weight of the wind, its surface vibrating with a high-pitched, metallic shriek that sounded like a violin string stretched past its breaking point. The fine, freezing mist of salt water continued to hiss through the expanding splits, coating the dark oak dining table and the empty leather chairs in a dull, gray film of salt crust that looked like winter frost in the gloom. Marie stood less than 3 feet from the trembling barrier, her body perfectly still, her face illuminated by the pale, rhythmic sweeps of the harbor lighthouse miles away. She had not retreated to the safety of the rear bedrooms, instead, she remained rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the precise intersection where the window's fracture met the sharp, concentric triangles of her completed obsidian mosaic. In the dark, the artwork on its iron easel looked like a dark shard of the storm itself, its polished black facets absorbing the lighthouse beams and throwing them back as jagged needles of silver that seemed to lacerate the shadows of the room. The absolute fragility of her domestic space was no longer a metaphor, it was an immediate, physical reality that was unfolding inch by inch before her eyes. The walls she and Chris had built over the last decade, the clean, minimalist studio settings, the curated aesthetics, the deliberate, polite distances, were proving to be entirely useless against the unquantifiable weight of the world outside. They had believed that by avoiding the hard truths of their emotional drift, by keeping their separate lives tucked away in neat, parallel compartments, they could preserve the facade of their marriage indefinitely. But the storm was revealing that an architecture built on silence was nothing more than a temporary shelter made of glass, waiting for the right pressure to shatter it into 1,000 lethal pieces. A sudden, deeper shudder ran through the entire frame of the apartment, followed by a sickening, hollow pop as the central aluminum mullion buckled under the wind's thrust. The western glass pane gave way entirely. It did not break into neat shards. Under the immense atmospheric pressure, the thick sheet of safety glass exploded inward with a deafening, percussive roar that sounded like a bomb detonating inside the room. A massive wave of freezing ocean wind and black water rushed through the opening, instantly blowing out the curtains, scattering the white linen placemats across the room like dead birds, and knocking over the heavy iron chairs with a series of loud, splintering crashes. Marie did not scream. As the violent torrent of brine and cold air struck her chest, blowing her dark hair across her face and soaking her wool sweater within seconds, she felt a sudden, terrifying sense of liberation wash over her like an icy wave. The invisible boundary was gone. The storm was inside the house now, mixing the raw salt of the Atlantic with the dust of her studio, erasing the last remaining traces of the sterile sanctuary she had tried so desperately to maintain. She looked at the obsidian mosaic, which had been knocked askew by the force of the blast but remained unbroken on its heavy iron stand, its black facets now slick and gleaming with the incoming seawater. Through the gaping hole where the window had been, the roaring voice of the sea filled the apartment, a chaotic, unyielding rhythm that seemed to demand a final, absolute surrender. Marie stepped forward into the very center of the ruin, her boots submerged in the inches of salt water that were already pooling on the hardwood floorboards. She did not look back at the dark hallway or the safety of the inner rooms. She stood at the very edge of the fractured sill, her face wet with brine, looking out into the pitch-black void of the Atlantic basin, knowing with an absolute, unmitigated certainty that the third movement of her life had ended in a spectacular, irreversible collapse, and that whatever came next would have to be built from the very wreckage of the storm itself. Chapter 20, The Ascent of the Headland. The final stretch of the cliffside path had been completely obliterated by the fury of the equinoctial gale, transforming the familiar gravel track into a treacherous, shifting staircase of slick clay and loose slate. Chris fought his way upward through the absolute blackness of the ridge, his body bent nearly double against the terrifying force of the wind that screamed off the open Atlantic. The rain had ceased to fall vertically, it was driven horizontally across the headland in thick, needle-sharp sheets of salt spray that stung his eyes and cut his face. Every step was a separate, agonizing negotiation with gravity. His boots slipped repeatedly on the collapsing mud banks, his fingernails tearing to the quick as he clawed at the sodden clumps of beach grass to prevent himself from being swept backward down the sheer rock face into the churning cauldron of the basin below. His lungs burned with a raw, metallic heat, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that were instantly torn from his lips by the wind. The yellow oilskin jacket he had worn all summer hung from his shoulders in useless, sodden rags, offering no protection against the freezing brine that had soaked through his clothes to the very bone. Yet he felt nothing of the physical cold, his entire consciousness had narrowed to a single, burning point of focus, the high, dark silhouette of the apartment building perched at the apex of the promontory. From his position on the lower ridge, he could see that the structure was completely dark, its usual warm, curated lights extinguished by the power failure, leaving it to look like a ruined stone fortress holding its ground against a siege. As he reached the upper terrace gate, his heart seized with a cold, paralyzing dread that owed nothing to the physical exertion of the climb. In the rhythmic, sweeping glare of the distant harbor lighthouse, he could see the catastrophic reality of the upper deck. The heavy iron gate had been torn from its hinges, and the terrace itself was completely awash under 2 inches of bubbling white foam. More terrifying than the water, however, was the structural void at the center of the facade. The massive panoramic glass wall, the proud, invisible barrier that had defined their modern domestic sanctuary for a decade, was entirely gone. A jagged, gaping maw of broken aluminum and shattered frames lay exposed to the sky, looking like a massive, violent wound in the side of the building. Chris scrambled over the wet debris of the terrace, his boots crunching loudly on the millions of microscopic safety-glass crystals that covered the concrete like a layer of coarse diamond dust. He lunged through the ruined opening, stepping over the buckled metal track directly into the dark living room. The scene inside was one of total, unmitigated devastation. The freezing ocean wind was howling through the apartment with the force of a jet engine, tearing the remaining art books from the shelves, scattering loose papers through the air like winter leaves, and sending the white linen placemats spinning into the dark corners of the dining area. The hardwood floorboards were completely submerged under a swirling sheet of brackish water that reflected the erratic, violet flashes of the distant storm clouds. In the center of this dripping, windswept ruin, Marie stood perfectly still. She was positioned directly in front of her heavy iron easel, her dark wool sweater soaked through and clinging to her arms, her hair plastered across her wet cheeks by the spray. She did not turn her head when Chris entered, nor did she make any sign that she had heard his frantic, waterlogged approach over the roar of the gale. Her eyes remained fixed on the dark, gleaming surface of her completed obsidian mosaic, which stood remarkably upright despite the chaos around it, its polished black facets catching the lighthouse beams and throwing back a fractured, shimmering mirror image of the broken room and the two solitary figures within it. Chris stopped 5 feet away from her, his hands trembling at his sides, his chest heaving with a profound, breathless exhaustion. For months, he had envisioned this return, he had imagined a confrontation of words, a desperate, technical explanation of his absence, a structural argument to patch the cracks in their life just as he had tried to patch the stones of the customs house. But standing here in the raw, unyielding reality of the ruined apartment, the utter futility of his technical language became absolute. There were no calculations that could repair the shattered glass, no concrete formulas that could bridge the emotional chasm that had opened between them during the long, silent summer. The illusion of their sterile, protected isolation had been completely demolished by the sea, leaving them exposed to the elements and to each other. He looked from Marie's pale, static profile to the dark geometry of the mosaic, and for the first time, he truly understood the design she had been working on all year. It was not a decorative piece, it was a monument to the very fracture they had lived through, an architectural map of their separate, silent survival. The storm had not destroyed their home, it had simply removed the invisible panels that had prevented them from touching the truth. As a massive wave crashed against the lower cliff face, sending a deep, subterranean shudder through the floorboards beneath their boots, Chris took a single, slow step forward into the water, his eyes meeting Marie's wet reflection in the black obsidian glass, waiting in the absolute, roaring silence of the room for the first true movement of their wreckage to begin. Chapter 21, The Clearing of the Silt. The dawn that followed the equinoctial gale did not arrive with a dramatic burst of light, but rather as a slow, cold filtration of slate-gray illumination that gradually peeled back the heavy shadows from the headland. By 7 in the morning, the wind had finally lost its hostile, screaming edge, dropping into a low, exhausted moan that soughed through the ruined frames of the cliffside apartment. The Atlantic far below had retreated from its predatory high-water mark, though its surface remained a churning, mud-streaked expanse of whitecaps that slapped rhythmically against the salt-bleached cliffs. The air inside the living room was freezing and perfectly still, thick with the heavy, unyielding smells of raw seaweed, wet plaster, and the cold, damp scent of waterlogged oak. The full extent of the structural wreckage lay exposed in the unforgiving morning light. The eastern wall of the room was caked in a fine, glittering crust of dried brine, and the expensive wool rugs had been transformed into heavy, sodden mats of dark gray fiber that pooled with black silt in the corners. Near the center of the floorboards, where the water had risen highest before draining down the central air shafts, a thick layer of fine harbor sand had settled over the dark hardwood, creating a miniature, desert-like topography of delicate ridges and damp furrows inside the domestic space. The heavy iron chairs lay exactly where the midnight blast had dropped them, their metal legs twisted askew across the threshold. Marie was the first to move, her body stiff from hours of sleepless vigil in the damp cold. Without a sound, she walked to the rear utility closet and retrieved 2 heavy galvanized steel buckets and a pair of worn wood-handled stable brooms. She did not look at Chris, who sat slumped against the dry base of the kitchen island, his face gray with exhaustion, his fingers caked in the dried mud of the harbor trench. She simply dropped one of the brooms at his feet with a dull, hollow thud that echoed through the quiet apartment, and then moved to the western edge of the room to begin the manual work of reclamation. The rhythm of their labor became their only language, an unspoken, physical choreography that replaced the sterile silences of the past year. Marie worked from the outer terrace inward, using the stiff bristles of her broom to push the thick piles of broken glass crystals and wet foam over the edge of the concrete sill into the void below. Each stroke of the broom made a sharp, dry rasping sound that cut through the morning stillness like a knife. Chris stood up slowly, his joints groaning with a deep, systemic ache, and took up his position at the opposite side of the room. He began the slow, heavy task of shoveling the black harbor silt into the steel buckets, his large hands moving with the same deliberate, methodical precision he had once used to lay the concrete foundations at the customs house. There was no attempt to save the ruined artifacts of their curated life. Together, they carried the waterlogged art monographs, the swollen linen placemats, and the shredded remains of Chris's architectural drawings out to the terrace, stacking them in a silent, sodden pile of refuse to be claimed by the morning sun. Yet when they reached the center of the room where the heavy iron easel stood, their movements naturally synchronized into a cautious, protective slowness. The black obsidian mosaic remained completely intact on its stand, its polished triangular facets now clean of dust, catching the pale gray morning light and reflecting it as a series of calm, steady silver beams that illuminated the wet floorboards around it. As Chris lifted the heavy iron frame of the easel to realign it with the center of the room, Marie reached out her hand, her fingers stopping just above his raw, scarred knuckles to steady the weight. For a single, suspended second, their eyes met across the dark geometry of the glass stone. There was no apology in the glance, no sudden, romantic resolution to the emotional drift that had eroded their marriage over the long summer months. The structural damage to their life was absolute and irreversible. The invisible, protective panels that had kept them safe from one another could never be reinstalled. But as Marie took the handle of the steel bucket from his hand and moved back toward the flooded terrace, her boots leaving a clean, clear track in the damp sand, Chris felt a quiet, grounded stillness settle deep within his chest. They were no longer hiding behind glass, they were two builders standing in the very wreckage of their own design, manually clearing the silt from the foundation, ready to see what kind of structure could be raised from the bare, unyielding stone that remained. Chapter 22, The Survey of the Ruins. The third morning after the equinoctial deluge brought a sharp, crystalline clarity to the coastal basin, as if the violence of the storm had scrubbed the atmosphere clean of all humidity and haze. The sky had hardened into a brilliant, unyielding vault of pale sapphire, and the horizontal autumn sun cast long, razor-sharp shadows across the scarred face of the headland. From the open, windowless perimeter of the cliffside apartment, Chris looked down at the harbor district 2 miles away. The ocean had completely receded from the streets, leaving behind a thick, uniform crust of gray silt that covered the wharves and the lower facades of the warehouses like an ash shroud. The time for immediate, chaotic survival had transitioned into the cold, analytical phase of assessment. Chris dressed in a clean, salt-stiffened canvas jacket and picked up his heavy leather surveyor's bag, which contained his brass plumb bobs, steel tape measures, and a fresh ledger of waterproof grid paper. He left the apartment without a sound, his boots crunching lightly on the clean concrete of the terrace which Marie had spent the previous afternoon scouring with coarse sea sand. He did not look back at the interior where she sat on the floor, her fingers meticulously sorting through a small wooden crate of unused obsidian tiles, completely absorbed in the silent mechanics of her own restoration. The descent into the harbor district was a journey through a landscape that had been profoundly reordered. The familiar coastal road was choked with piles of tangled driftwood, shredded fishing nets, and the skeletal remains of old timber piers that had been torn from their beds by the high tide. When Chris finally reached the central atrium of the old customs house, he found the historic structure standing in a state of grim, monumental isolation. The high limestone walls were dry now, but a dark, horizontal water stain ran along the masonry at chest height, marking the exact level where the brackish slurry had held the building captive during the midnight crisis. The interior was hollow, echoing, and bitterly cold. The excavation trench at the center of the atrium had been transformed into a flat, solid floor of dried mud that had cracked into thousands of tiny, geometric fissures as the water evaporated. Chris walked slowly toward the western support pier, his eyes tracing the massive structural failure that had driven him from the site 3 nights prior. The 3-ton foundation stone had settled deep into the silt, and the primary limestone archway remained frozen in its state of collapse, its crown split cleanly down the center with a gap that was now wide enough to admit a man's hand. He knelt in the dry dust at the base of the pier, retrieving his steel caliper and his notebook. With meticulous, mechanical focus, he began to measure the exact degree of the archway's lateral displacement, logging the numbers in neat, parallel columns on the grid paper. For months, these numbers had been his absolute metric of reality. He had believed that by tracking every millimeter of movement, he could control the destiny of the monument and force the ancient stone to conform to his engineering will. But as he looked through the wide fracture in the arch's crown, seeing the brilliant blue of the morning sky completely exposed through the ruined timber roof above, a profound change settled over his understanding. The failure of the arch was not a defeat, it was a definitive disclosure of truth. The building had reached its structural limit, shedding its artificial stability to reveal the raw, unyielding physics of its old age. No amount of modern steel shoring or chemical injections could ever make this pier carry the weight of the modern world again. It was a monument that belonged to the past, and its true integrity lay not in a forced, artificial restoration, but in a dignified acceptance of its decay. He closed the leather ledger with a sharp, decisive snap, leaving the remaining columns of the grid completely empty. He did not need to calculate any further. The survey was complete. Chris stood up and slung the heavy surveyor's bag over his shoulder, his mind suddenly feeling as light and clear as the autumn sky outside. He looked at the cracked limestone arch one final time, acknowledging the silent lesson it had carved into the shadows of the atrium. He had spent his entire life trying to anchor things, monuments, marriages, memories, to a stable, unmoving ideal, treating every natural fracture as a catastrophic flaw that needed to be patched and hidden away. He turned toward the eastern exit, his boots kicking up small clouds of gray stone dust as he walked out into the brilliant morning sun, ready to return to the headland not to rebuild the invisible glass walls of his past, but to begin the honest, dangerous work of living within the open structure that remained. Chapter 23, The Assembly of Shards. The wind had entirely abandoned the headland by the 5th afternoon following the equinoctial gale, leaving behind an eerie, high-altitude stillness that caused the sea to resemble a vast sheet of hammered tin under the pale autumn sun. Within the windowless perimeter of the living room, the atmosphere had settled into a cold, dry equilibrium. Marie sat cross-legged on the bare, scoured oak floorboards, surrounded by a series of shallow wooden crates she had painstakingly salvaged from the flooded basement storage. The light filtering through the open concrete threshold was sharp and surgical, casting no soft edges, exposing every scratch on the wood and every stain on the plaster with absolute, unblinking clarity. Her focus had narrowed to the physical sorting of debris. In the largest crate lay the raw materials of her previous life, thousands of uniform, machine-cut squares of polished black obsidian, each one identical in its smooth, light-absorbing perfection. For months, she had relied on that sterile uniformity to create a sense of orderly, predictable beauty. But in the crates to her left, a completely different texture had accumulated. Over the last 48 hours, she had systematically collected the jagged, irregular remnants of the disaster itself, thick shards of the shattered panoramic window, fragments of sea-bleached driftwood, and coarse, multicolored pebbles of granite that had been thrown onto the terrace by the highest swells. The work of assembly began not with a sketch or a formal blueprint, but with a direct, intuitive confrontation with the materials. Marie hoisted a fresh, unprimed timber panel onto the heavy iron easel, its rough surface smelling faintly of pine resin and damp earth. She did not reach for the pristine obsidian tiles. Instead, her fingers selected a massive, triangular shard of the broken safety glass. The edge was lethal and uneven, its internal lamination cloudy with microscopic fractures from the midnight blast. She pressed it firmly into the thick layer of dark mortar she had spread across the base of the panel, the wet adhesive oozing up around the sharp crystal borders with a soft, sucking sound. The rhythmic, repetitive mechanics of the labor became a sanctuary from the heavy weight of her own thoughts. One by one, she began to interlock the broken pieces of the window with the polished segments of the old obsidian. It was an erratic, difficult geometry that defied the clean symmetry of her earlier campaigns. The sharp, translucent glass fragments refracted the autumn sunlight into erratic needles of silver, while the dark obsidian absorbed the beams, creating a harsh, contorted pattern of light and shadow that looked like the surface of the sea during a squall. Her hands became nicked and stained with fine lines of dried blood where the glass had bitten into her palms, but she felt no impulse to stop or shield herself. This new canvas was the first honest architecture she had attempted in years. She was no longer trying to construct an invisible barrier to keep the world out, nor was she attempting to simulate a perfect, curated piece that did not exist. By forcing the broken elements of the destruction into the same frame as the remnants of her deliberate design, she was documenting the exact trajectory of her collapse. The mosaic was becoming a monument to the fracture itself, a heavy, unyielding testament that their domestic sanctuary could never return to its pristine, isolated state, and that any future they built would have to accommodate the sharp, dangerous edges of the truth. When Chris returned up the cliffside path later that evening, the heavy leather surveyor's bag slung loosely over his shoulder, he stopped at the threshold of the room, his boots halting on the clean concrete line. He did not step inside, nor did he offer any greeting into the quiet room. He simply stood in the fading amber light, his eyes tracing the massive, jagged expanse of the new mosaic that dominated the studio space. In the dimming twilight, the mixture of clear shattered glass and dark stone looked like a living lung of rock and ice, raw and incomplete, yet completely balanced in its structural ruin. He looked from the canvas to Marie's stained fingers, acknowledging the silent, domestic reordering that was taking place before him, understanding with an absolute clarity that the clearing of the silt was over, and the era of composition had begun. Chapter 24, The Installation of the Frame. The second week following the equinoctial storm began with the arrivals of the heavy commercial flatbed trucks, their diesel engines groaning as they navigated the narrow, hairpin turns of the cliffside road to the apex of the headland. A team of 4 industrial glazing technicians, dressed in identical canvas overalls and heavy leather safety harness riggings, took possession of the terrace just after sunrise. The crystalline blue skies of the previous days had faded into a thick, uniform ceiling of heavy autumnal stratus clouds that hung low over the Atlantic, turning the surface of the sea into a vast, unmoving floor of dull graphite. The temperature on the ridge had dropped significantly, forcing the moisture from the air to condense into a cold, persistent dew that slicked the raw metal frames lying across the concrete. Chris stood at the western corner of the living room, his hands driven deep into the pockets of his canvas jacket, his role reduced from an active director of structural physics to a passive observer of an external intervention. The workers moved with a synchronized, mechanical efficiency that left no room for sentiment or hesitation. First came the removal of the jagged, storm-twisted aluminum tracks that had anchored the old glass wall for a decade. The technicians used heavy iron crowbars and pneumatic drills to rip the buckled metal from the structural concrete header, filling the quiet apartment with a deafening, rhythmic clatter that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the remaining pottery on the kitchen shelves. Marie did not flee from the noise. She had moved her heavy iron easel and her half-completed mosaic of glass shards into the narrow corridor that led to the bedrooms, effectively retreating into the interior spine of the apartment. From this recessed vantage point, she sat on an upturned wooden crate, her eyes fixed on the open terrace where the new architecture was being lifted into place. The workers had anchored a massive dual-suction crane to the concrete deck, using its hydraulic arms to hoist the replacement framing, a heavy, matte black industrial steel chassis designed to withstand double the wind load of the previous structure. The black metal silhouette cut sharply across the gray horizon, looking like a heavy, permanent cage being dropped over their domestic space. The arrival of the new glass panels required the coordinated physical strength of the entire crew. 2 massive sheets of triple laminated, reinforced structural glass, each weighing over 400 pounds, were hoisted from the flatbed and swung slowly across the terrace threshold. The glass was not the perfectly transparent, invisible medium that had defined their previous existence, it had a distinct, heavy green tint along its polished edges, a physical manifestation of its immense thickness and defensive density. As the technicians guided the first panel into the deep rubber gaskets of the steel track, the massive sheet caught the dull gray light of the sky, creating a sudden, solid reflection that instantly severed the living room from the open Atlantic outside. The closing of the perimeter was a profound, almost suffocating transformation. As the final perimeter seals were injected with black silicone adhesive, the howling draft that had scrubbed the apartment clean for 2 weeks was instantly strangled. A heavy, synthetic stillness descended upon the room, trapping the smells of new rubber, industrial solvent, and the damp, lingering odor of the harbor silt within the sealed enclosure. Chris took a long, slow breath, feeling the immediate rise in temperature as the building's automated climate control clicked back to life somewhere in the walls, its low, mechanical hum replacing the raw, unpredictable voice of the sea. He walked slowly toward the newly installed barrier, placing his palm flat against the cold surface of the reinforced glass. The material did not give or vibrate under the pressure of his hand, it felt as solid and unyielding as the limestone piers of the customs house. Through the green-tinted transparency, the ocean below looked distant and contained, transformed once more into a scenic view rather than an immediate, threatening presence. He turned back toward the dark corridor where Marie remained seated beside her mosaic, her fingers tracing the sharp, irregular contours of the storm shards she had permanently embedded in the mortar. The physical frame of their life had been restored, stronger and heavier than before, but the internal space remained completely altered, its domestic geography permanently redefined by the 2 weeks they had spent exposed to the open sky. Chapter 25, The Preservation of the Frost. By the first week of December, the transition on the headland was absolute. The low, heavy stratus clouds of autumn had given way to a vast, pale lavender vault that seemed to draw the residual warmth out of the earth and into the freezing vacuum of space. Below the cliffs, the Atlantic had lost its muddy, storm-driven fury, settling instead into a dark, viscous indigo, its swells moving with a slow, heavy deliberation that suggested the water was thickening toward ice. A sharp, systemic frost had locked the ridge in place, coating the stunted coastal gorse and the concrete perimeter of the terrace in a fine, silver fur of ice needles that did not melt, even at noon. Inside the apartment, the silence had lost its hostile, defensive edge, becoming instead something dense, quiet, and functional. The new, green-tinted structural glass wall stood as an unyielding barrier against the north wind, which whistled thinly against the matte black steel frame without causing a single vibration in the room. The interior air was warm and perfectly dry, smelling of cedarwood from the hearth and the faint, chemically sweet scent of the oil wax Chris had used to seal the scrubbed hardwood floorboards. The domestic space had been stripped of its previous clutter, there were no new art monographs to replace the ones lost, and the empty spaces on the plaster walls gave the room the clean, detached quality of a gallery during a winter hiatus. Marie's completed mosaic occupied the exact center of the eastern wall, anchored directly into the structural masonry by heavy masonry bolts Chris had driven into the plaster. In the crystalline winter light, the massive panel looked less like an artistic composition and more like a geological cross-section of the headland itself. The thousands of jagged fragments of the old panoramic window, cloudy, fractured, and sharp, interlocked seamlessly with the dark, light-absorbing squares of the polished obsidian tiles and the raw granite pebbles from the beach. It was a heavy, monumental record of the disruption, frozen in place, refusing to offer a clean pattern or a comforting resolution, but holding the light of the winter sun and scattering it across the room in 1,000 cold, unpredictable slivers. Chris stood at the kitchen island, his large hands carefully wrapping the brass calipers and the plumb bobs from his surveyor's bag into squares of oiled linen before placing them into a deep wooden storage chest. His retirement from the Customs House project was now an official matter of record, his signature on the final structural disclaimer having severed his connection to the Harbor District 3 weeks prior. He did not feel the weight of an uncompleted task. As he closed the lid of the chest, his eyes moved to the window, tracing the line of the coastal path where the frozen mud had hardened into permanent, deep ridges. Marie walked into the room from the corridor, dressed in a heavy, charcoal gray wool coat that came down to her boots. She did not stop to look at the mosaic, nor did she glance toward Chris as he stood by the wooden chest. Her movements were deliberate and devoid of hesitation. She walked straight to the glass threshold, slid the heavy black steel door open with a muted, mechanical hiss that let a sudden, knife-like draft of freezing air into the room, and stepped out onto the frost-rimed concrete of the terrace. She did not lock her hands in her pockets or shield her face from the wind, she simply stood at the iron railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark sea met the pale lavender sky. Chris did not follow her out, nor did he remain within the warm cocoon of the kitchen. Instead, he walked to the hallway closet, retrieved his own heavy canvas coat, and moved toward the open threshold. He stopped exactly at the boundary line, his boots resting on the thick rubber gasket of the track, half his body exposed to the freezing winter draft, the other half remaining within the heated perimeter of the room. He looked at the back of her coat, then down at the harbor below, where a single, unidentifiable cargo ship was slowly moving out of the basin, its hull cutting a clean, dark line through the graying water toward the open ocean. The future did not present itself as a blueprint or a shared promise. The physical repairs to the structure were complete, the fractures were permanently documented in the stone and glass on the wall, and the season of destruction had passed. Yet as the first flakes of a dry, powdery winter snow began to drift horizontally across the headland, catching on the green edges of the glass and the wool of their coats, neither of them moved to close the door or step closer to one another. They remained suspended on the threshold, perfectly balanced between the shelter they had fortified and the cold, unmapped expanse that lay entirely open before them.